Hey, welcome back, friend. I'm so glad you're here tonight. Whether you're tucked into bed right now, stretched out on the couch with a blanket pulled up to your chin, or just winding down after a long day with the lights already low, this one is for you. Tonight, we're going somewhere quiet. Not a battlefield, not a palace throne room, not some grand military campaign decorated with flags and cannon smoke. We're going somewhere far more interesting than that. We're going to a drawing room. Picture it. A soft, private room on the upper floor of a tall London townhouse. The walls are papered in deep green, the colour of old moss after rain. Heavy curtains are drawn across the windows, but you can hear it. Steady, patient, unhurried. Rain tapping against the glass, just quietly. The way English rain does when it has settled in for the evening and has no intention of leaving. There is a fire in the grate, not a roaring fire, a sensible, warming fire, the kind that makes the whole room feel like it's breathing slowly. It crackles now and then, shifts slightly, sends a small ribbon of orange light across the ceiling and down along the walls. The room smells of coal and beeswax and something faintly floral. A vase of flowers on the writing table, slightly past their best but still holding their colour. There are books on every surface, letters, a small lacquered box, a silver letter opener resting against an inkwell. On the side table there is a pot of tea. Someone made it not long ago. The steam is still rising in a gentle curve, drifting upward, fading into the warm air of the room. There is a small plate of biscuits beside it that no one has touched yet. The clock on the mantelpiece reads 9:15. Outside, London is doing what London always does in the evening. Moving, talking, carrying on. But in here, all of that feels very far away. And in this room, in rooms very much like this one, all across London, all across England, all across the 63 long and remarkable years of the Victorian era, something very important was happening. Something that no history book ever quite captured the way it deserved. Because in this room, a woman was thinking. She was reading letters. She was drafting responses. She was deciding, very quietly and very carefully, which man would be invited to dinner on Saturday, which invitation would be declined, which journalist would receive a whispered detail, which member of Parliament would find himself gently steered, over a cup of tea and a very carefully chosen word, toward a particular vote. She held no office. She cast no ballot. She could not stand in Parliament or address a courtroom or sign a treaty with her own name. But she ran things. Not entirely from the shadows. She would have found that framing a little dramatic if you'd said it to her face. She would have smiled, set down her cup, and told you that she simply did what needed to be done. And what needed to be done in Victorian England was everything. Tonight, we're going to sit with these women for a while. We're going to move through their world slowly, the way you would if you'd actually been there, through drawing rooms and private salons, through the back corridors of power and the quiet gardens of enormous country houses, through candlelit studies and the rustling, perfumed rooms where the real decisions were made. We are going to meet women whose names you may not know, and by the time we're done, I think you'll understand something important about how the Victorian era actually worked. Not the official version, the real version. But first, if this kind of storytelling helps your evenings feel a little slower and a little richer, it would mean a great deal if you hit subscribe on Sleep History with Sikandar and left a like on this video. Drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching from tonight. Are you in bed? On the sofa? I genuinely love knowing. Now, dim those lights if you can. Let the room get a little quieter, and let's begin. Here is the first thing you need to understand about Victorian England. On paper, it was a world almost entirely controlled by men. Men sat in Parliament. Men wrote the laws. Men ran the newspapers and the banks and the courts and the factories and the ships and the army. Men signed the treaties. Men made the speeches. Men wore the wigs in the courtroom and the hats in the boardroom and the medals on Remembrance Sunday. Women officially did not vote, did not stand for Parliament, could not, without their husband's permission, control their own property, could not, in many professional settings, use their own name. If a woman wanted to study medicine, the great medical schools were closed to her. If she wanted to study at Oxford or Cambridge, she could attend lectures but could not receive a degree, not until decades later. If she ran a business, the law in many cases treated the profits as belonging to her husband. If she wanted to write professionally, she was advised, quite openly, to use a man's name. If she wanted to speak publicly about politics, she was considered eccentric at best. That is the official version. Here is what actually happened. Because here's the thing about power in Victorian England. It was not clean. It was not tidy. It did not sit neatly inside the official structures that Parliament and the newspapers described. Power is never quite that polite. Power in Victorian England moved the way that water moves, through whatever channel it could find. And the channels that women discovered, created and mastered were extraordinary. They were called salons, dinner parties, country house weekends, letters of introduction, charitable foundations, royal households, quietly arranged marriages, carefully chosen invitations, social positions that to an outsider looked purely ceremonial and were in practice deeply strategic. The women who navigated these channels were not amateurs. They were not hobbyists dabbling in politics from the margins. They were experts, trained from birth, educated, not at universities which were largely closed to them, but in something arguably more useful, the precise study of human behaviour, social architecture, and the exercise of influence without authority. They learned to read people, to remember names and faces and affiliations and ambitions and the small personal details that, deployed at the right moment, could open a door that no formal letter of introduction could unlock. They learned to listen more than they spoke, to speak at exactly the right moment, in exactly the right register, to exactly the right person. They had to be better at it than anyone else, because they had none of the official tools, and yet, when historians go back and study the great political decisions of the Victorian era, the cabinet reshuffles, the foreign policy pivots, the reform bills, the royal appointments, the shifts in public opinion that preceded major legislation, they keep finding something unexpected. A woman's hand, not always visible, not always documented, but there, consistently, in the letters, in the diaries, in the records of who attended which dinner, and who said what to whom, and whose advice was quietly sought before the official decision was announced. Think about that for a moment. The era most famous for restricting women's lives was, in practice, heavily shaped by women who had mastered the art of working within these restrictions, and bending them quietly in directions that suited their intelligence and their ambition. I find that quietly astonishing. Let me tell you a little about the world these women were born into, because the Victorian era is not one single thing. It spans 63 years, from 1837, when a young woman named Victoria took the throne at 18 years old, through to 1901, when she died as the most powerful monarch in the world. 63 years is a very long time, long enough for fashions to change 3 or 4 times, long enough for entire technologies, the steam engine, the telegraph, the railway network, electric light, to transform daily life from something almost medieval into something recognisably modern. When Victoria became queen, people still travelled by horse and candlelight. When she died, there were motor cars on the streets of London, and electric trams and the first public telephones, and long enough for the position of women to shift, slowly, incrementally, painfully slowly, but genuinely. At the beginning of the Victorian era, a married woman legally did not exist as a separate person from her husband. Her property was his property. Her earnings were his earnings. Her debts were his debts. The Married Women's Property Acts of 1870 and 1882 would eventually change this, but for most of the era, women of the upper and middle classes operated in a world with extraordinarily rigid formal constraints. And yet, here is the detail that I find genuinely fascinating. The very same society that restricted women's legal personhood placed enormous social importance on the spaces and roles that women controlled. The home was a woman's domain. In the Victorian imagination, and in a great deal of Victorian reality, the home was not a minor, private, inconsequential space. It was a moral and social centre. It was the place where the character of the next generation was formed. It was the place where relationships between powerful people were built or damaged. It was the place where the week's most consequential conversations happened. Not in the chamber, not in the boardroom, but over the dinner table, in the drawing room, in the quiet, careful hours after the servants had withdrawn, and the real talking could begin. The woman who ran a great household was managing budgets, supervising staff, organising the education of children, hosting political allies, shaping the reputations of everyone who passed through her front door. She was, in every practical sense, a manager, an administrator, a diplomat, a strategist. She just wasn't called any of those things. She was called a hostess, a wife, a lady. And the best of them understood, with a clarity that would have impressed any modern political consultant, that those roles were not limitations. They were positions, and positions in the right hands are instruments of power. The rain is still falling outside. You can hear it if you listen. That steady, soft percussion against the window glass, the slight rush of it along the gutters and drain pipes, the muffled sound of London continuing its business somewhere below and beyond the warmth of this room. The fire shifts. A log settles. The light changes for a moment, brighter, then steadier. There is something I want to say before we go any further into this story. The women we're going to meet tonight were not saints. Most of them were wealthy. Most of them were aristocratic or close to it. They operated within a class system that benefited them enormously, and which they, for the most part, had no interest in dismantling. Their power was real, but it was also conditional on that system continuing to function the way it always had. I want to be honest about that, because the story of Victorian women's influence is not a simple story of brave heroines fighting a corrupt system. It is a much more complicated story than that. It is a story of women who were extraordinarily skilled at operating inside a system that was in many ways deeply unjust, and finding within it the exact points where their intelligence and their social position could be brought to bear. Some of them used that influence for genuine good. Some of them used it primarily for their own advancement and their family's ambitions. Most of them used it for both, the way most powerful people throughout history always have. I find that detail important. It makes them real, and it makes what they accomplished, inside a world that told them, repeatedly, that they were not capable of such things, all the more striking. The drawing room is warm. Your tea is probably cool by now. That's all right. There's a chair near the fire, not the formal chair by the window, the good one, the soft one with the wide arms, and the cushion that has learned the shape of someone who sat in it for years. Settle into it, because we have a long evening ahead of us, and the story we're about to move through, the story of these quiet architects, these invisible hands, these women who shaped an empire from the rooms that history almost forgot. That story deserves to be told slowly. It deserves to be felt. So close your eyes for a moment if you'd like. Listen to the rain. Listen to the fire. Listen to the clock on the mantelpiece, marking the quarter hours in the way that old clocks do, steadily and without urgency. And when you're ready, we'll begin at the place where so much of Victorian power actually lived. Not in Parliament, not in the palace, but in the long, brilliant, carefully managed rooms that the great ladies of the era called their salons. The word salon sounds French because it is. The tradition of the political salon, a regular gathering of writers, politicians, philosophers, and other influential figures, hosted by an aristocratic woman in her private home, had its roots in France, specifically in the great salons of Paris in the 17th and 18th centuries, where women like Madame de Pompadour and Madame Geoffrin had held court over the intellectual life of a nation. Paris had understood, long before London, that the conversation was where power lived. And Paris had understood that the woman who controlled the room controlled the conversation. The British version was, characteristically, a little less flamboyant, a little more understated, a little more English, but no less powerful. By the mid-Victorian period, every serious political hostess in London maintained what amounted to a private intelligence operation. Her drawing room was her command centre. Her dinner table was her negotiating floor. Her invitation list was her most carefully guarded strategic asset. She knew things that no newspaper printed. She heard things that never appeared in official minutes. She understood, through years of careful observation, the real positions of men whose public statements bore almost no resemblance to their private intentions. Think about what that means for a moment. In an era before telephone calls, before press briefings, before the formal machinery of party whipping was fully developed, the dinner table was one of the primary locations where the business of government was actually conducted, where alliances were formed and tested, where difficult conversations could be had privately, away from the public record, where a man could say something he couldn't say in the chamber and discover, over the course of a long dinner, whether it would be received well enough to say publicly. And the woman at the head of that table was not a passive observer of these conversations. She was orchestrating them. She had chosen who sat next to whom. She had decided, based on years of social intelligence, which combination of personalities would produce the most productive friction. She had read the letters, tracked the votes, followed the careers, noted the ambitions, and built in her mind a precise and constantly updated map of the political landscape, not the official one, not the one printed in the newspapers, but the real one, the one that told you who actually needed what, and who could be persuaded to give it. She was, in the language of the modern era, a power broker, and she was very, very good at it. The fire crackles softly, the rain continues its patient work against the glass, and in the next part of our story we move into that room, into the most famous salon of the Victorian era, and meet the woman who ran it. Her name was Frances, and she changed the course of British politics, quietly, over tea. That story is waiting for you, right on the other side of this moment. Stay with me. Her full name was Frances Elizabeth Ann Jolliffe, but she became known to Victorian England as Lady Palmerston. and to understand what that name meant, not the title, not the social standing, but the actual weight of it, the way it made people stop and pay attention when she entered a room. You need to understand something about the era she inhabited. The 1840s and 1850s in England were a period of enormous political turbulence. The old certainties were shifting. The Corn Laws had just been abolished, tearing the Conservative Party in two. Chartist protests were moving through the industrial cities. The Irish famine was sending shockwaves through the British conscience and the British economy. India was simmering. The Crimean War was approaching. It was a world in motion. A world where political allegiances that had seemed permanent were dissolving, where new ones were forming, where the old aristocratic certainties of Whig and Tory were giving way to something more complicated, more fluid, and considerably more dangerous for anyone who misjudged it. Men of enormous ambition and conflicting vision were circling each other in Westminster, watching for any advantage, any alliance, any weakening of an opponent's position that could be used to press forward. And in the middle of all of this, calm, precise, beautifully dressed, and in absolute command of who sat next to whom at dinner, was Frances. She hosted her salon at Cambridge House on Piccadilly. The house was large, the rooms were wide, and on Saturday evenings throughout the political season, it filled with almost every significant person in British public life. Let me describe it for you for a moment. Cambridge House on a Saturday evening in the political season. You arrive by carriage on Piccadilly. The street is busy even at this hour, the clatter of horses and wheels echoing against the stone. You step out and cross to the entrance. The door is opened before you reach it. Inside, the hallway is lit by many candles. The smell is of flowers and warm food and good wine. From somewhere upstairs you can hear the low, pleasant sound of many conversations happening at once. Not loud, not raucous, but alive. The sound of people who are genuinely interested in what the person across from them is saying. You give your coat to a servant. You are announced. And then you walk into a room where, depending on the evening, you might find the Foreign Secretary in conversation with a leading journalist, a senior diplomat from the French embassy, speaking quietly with an opposition MP, a rising cabinet minister being introduced, very carefully by your hostess, to a man he very much needed to know. Almost everyone who received an invitation was there, and that was the point. Frances controlled the guest list, which means Frances controlled something more important than any single vote in the House of Commons. She controlled access. She controlled proximity. She controlled which politicians got to be in the same room as which other politicians, which journalists, which foreign diplomats, which civil servants, which emerging talents, and which declining reputations. In a world where personal connection was everything, where policy was shaped over dinner rather than in formal committees, controlling the guest list was controlling the conversation. Think about what that means. If you were a rising politician in the 1850s and you wanted your career to accelerate, you needed to be seen at the right events. You needed to be in the rooms where the right people gathered. You needed someone to introduce you, correctly, strategically, with the right framing, to the right allies. And if Frances decided you were not yet ready for Cambridge House, or if she decided you had behaved badly in some way, or if she simply found you dull and unlikely to contribute anything interesting, then you were not invited. And the people who were not invited to Cambridge House knew they were not invited. Everyone knew who was there and who wasn't. London's social world was not large. The intelligence network of gossip and observation that ran through it was extraordinarily efficient. Not receiving an invitation from Lady Palmerston was a statement, a quiet one, but a clear one. She'd been doing this for decades before she became Lady Palmerston. Frances had married Henry John Temple, the third Viscount Palmerston, in 1839, a man who would go on to serve twice as Prime Minister and who was, by general agreement, one of the most talented and infuriating politicians of his generation. But she had been socially and politically active long before that marriage, and long before Palmerston's greatest achievements. The salon was not built on her husband's reputation. His reputation was, in part, built on hers. This is the thing that the official histories almost always miss. The assumption is that political wives attended salons because they were wives of politicians. But in Frances's case, and in the cases of many of the women we'll meet tonight, the direction of influence sometimes ran the other way. The woman's social position and social skill created a platform that amplified the man's career. He was advantaged by being married to her. He had access through her to rooms and relationships he might otherwise have struggled to reach. I want you to sit with that for a moment, because it contradicts something very fundamental about the way we imagine this era. Frances was not, it should be said, operating in isolation. She was part of a wider landscape of political hostesses, women who, across the mid-Victorian era, maintained salons of varying political flavour and social influence. There was Lady Waldegrave at Strawberry Hill in Twickenham, who hosted a salon that became the social centre of the Liberal Party in its formative years. When the Liberals needed to cohere as a parliamentary force in the 1860s and 1870s, they did much of their early coalition building in her drawing room. Lady Waldegrave was younger than Frances, louder than Frances, and arguably even more strategically ambitious. She married 4 times, each time choosing a man whose political career she could advance, and each time succeeding. There was Lady Holland, earlier in the century, whose Holland House in Kensington was the gathering point for Whig intellectual life for 40 years. Holland House was not merely a grand building. It was an institution. The painter Landseer came there, the writer Sidney Smith came there, and his conversation was considered the finest in England. The historian Lord Macaulay worked on passages of his History of England while staying in its guest rooms. Lord Byron visited. William Wordsworth visited. The Austrian statesman Metternich dined there. Lady Holland, Elizabeth Vassall-Fox, presided over all of it with a famous, slightly terrifying authority. She was described by contemporaries as imperious, brilliant, and not always comfortable to be near. But the conversation at Holland House was considered the finest in London, and the conversation at Holland House was hers. There was Lady Jersey, whose icy command of Almack's, the most exclusive subscription club in London, gave her a power that was almost constitutionally significant. Almack's was where the aristocracy gathered to dance, to see and be seen, to make matches and end careers. Lady Jersey and the other female patronesses of Almack's controlled entry. Their vouchers were social passports. Being refused one was a kind of public shaming that could take years to recover from. The Duke of Wellington, the man who defeated Napoleon, was once turned away from Almack's because he arrived 11 minutes after the doors closed. The rule was absolute, no exceptions, and the women who made the rule enforced it. Think about that. The most decorated soldier in British history, turned away at the door by a committee of aristocratic women who decided that punctuality mattered more than his battlefield record. The rules were the point, the rules were the power. Back in the drawing room. The fire is still burning. The rain has settled into that quieter, more constant pattern. Not individual drops you can hear now, but a steady, soft, white noise against the windows. the kind of rain that makes the inside of a room feel even warmer by contrast. There's something about political salons, about the kind of rooms Frances Palmerston managed, that I find genuinely hard to translate into modern terms. We're used to thinking of political networking as something that happens in offices or conference rooms, or in the modern era, over video calls and in group chats. It is transactional. It is often documented. There are agendas and follow-up emails and calendar invites that record very precisely who was in which room at what time and what was discussed. But the Victorian salon was none of those things. It was a room. It was an evening. It was food, wine, conversation, music. The slow, unhurried passage of hours in pleasant company. It was designed deliberately to feel relaxing, to feel social rather than professional. And that quality, the warmth of it, the apparent casualness, was not accidental. It was the mechanism. Because people talk differently when they feel comfortable. They share things they wouldn't put in a letter. They admit doubts and ambitions and frustrations that they'd never say in a formal meeting. They bond. They trust. They form the kind of human connection that formal political structures can never fully manufacture. Frances Palmerston understood this as well as anyone who ever lived. She knew that the real conversations, the ones that actually changed things, didn't happen in Parliament. They happened in the 20 minutes before dinner, when two men who needed to reach an understanding about something difficult were placed side by side in a sitting room with a glass of wine and an introduction from a hostess whose judgment they both trusted. She was the trusted party, the bridge, the person whose presence in the room made the conversation possible. Here is a detail I find particularly striking. Frances maintained her salon and her social influence right through the years when Palmerston was not in government, when he was in opposition, when he was unpopular, when his career looked as though it might be finished. The social capital she had built did not evaporate when the political winds shifted. It was hers, personal to her, not borrowed from his title or his position. And when he returned to power, as he did twice, that capital was still there. The relationships she had cultivated through those difficult years were intact. The network was intact. She had kept it warm, like a fire that's been carefully banked overnight and coaxed back to life in the morning. That is long-game thinking. That is strategic patience of an extraordinary order. Frances was not, in the conventional sense, a political ideologue. She did not have a programme she was trying to advance. She was not secretly running the Foreign Office or writing dispatches under her husband's name. What she was doing was something both subtler and more durable. She was building and maintaining the social infrastructure that made political life possible. Think of it this way. If Parliament was the river, Frances's salon, and salons like it, was the landscape through which the river ran. The shape of that landscape determined where the water went, how fast it moved, which tributaries it joined, and which it bypassed. You can't point to a single piece of legislation and say, Frances Palmerston caused this. It doesn't work like that. But historians who have studied the correspondence of the period, the letters and diaries and private accounts, consistently find that when political careers accelerated, when alliances formed, when difficult negotiations reached resolution, there was almost always a social event in the background, a dinner, a weekend in the country, an introduction made in someone's drawing room. And behind those events, behind the careful arrangement of those conversations, was a woman who understood the landscape better than almost anyone. There is a particular story about Frances that I want to share with you. It's small, domestic sounding, but I think it tells you more about the nature of her power than any grand political narrative could. In the late 1840s, a significant disagreement was developing between Palmerston, who was then Foreign Secretary, and Queen Victoria herself. It concerned Palmerston's habit of conducting foreign policy independently, of sending dispatches and making statements without first consulting the palace. Victoria found it intolerable. She complained repeatedly to Prime Minister Russell, to her advisers, and in her private journals. Palmerston refused to significantly change his behaviour. This was the kind of standoff that, in a more formal political environment, would have required formal intervention, formal negotiation, perhaps a formal censure. Instead, what happened was a series of social events, carefully arranged social events, at which the right people had the right conversations in the right rooms. Frances knew what the Queen needed to feel. She needed to feel that Palmerston respected her position, even if he continued to act independently. She knew what Palmerston needed. He needed the controversy to settle enough that he could continue working. She knew what the intermediaries needed. They needed to feel useful and trusted. And she arranged the conditions under which all of those needs could be, at least partially, met. Not through a formal negotiation, through an evening, through proximity, through the old, reliable alchemy of good food, good company, and a hostess who knew which door to open and which to leave gently, quietly closed. I find that quietly fascinating. It is not heroic in the way history tends to like its heroism. It doesn't make good statuary. You cannot put it on a plaque, but it worked. The rain has not stopped. If anything, it has deepened a little. The sound of it has spread, become more even, more surrounding. London out there is wet and dark and busy with its own concerns. In here, the fire is steady. The room is warm. The evening is long. And the story of Frances Palmerston is one piece, one important piece, of a much larger portrait. Because she was not alone in understanding this kind of power. Across the river, at Windsor, in the cool and carefully ordered world of the royal household, another woman had understood something very similar, had built something very similar, had wielded influence over the Queen herself, over Victoria, the most powerful woman in the world, in ways that no one would have guessed from the title she held. Her title was Mistress of the Robes. Her name was Harriet, and the relationship she built with Queen Victoria shaped the character of the monarchy itself. That story is waiting in the next room. Close your eyes for just a moment if you'd like. Breathe, and then let's go. Windsor Castle in the 1840s was not quite the place it would become. The great renovations and restorations were ongoing. New wings were being added, corridors were being widened, state apartments refitted, the whole vast machinery of the royal household reorganized and clarified. Victoria had been on the throne for only a few years. She was young, not yet 30, and she was learning, rapidly and sometimes painfully, what it meant to be the Queen of England. There is a particular quality to Windsor in winter that I want you to hold in your mind as we enter this part of the story. It is a fortress, an actual, original, medieval fortress, adapted and added to over centuries, but still at its core a castle. The stone is old. The corridors are long and cool and can feel on a winter day almost ecclesiastical. That particular quiet that belongs to very old buildings that have absorbed centuries of human life within their walls. The light comes through tall windows at an angle, falling in pale, slanted bars across stone floors and faded carpets. Outside, the grounds are large and formal, and, in winter, silent in the way that formal grounds always are when there are no leaves on the trees. The shapes of things are very clear. very precise. And inside, in the middle of all this ceremony, all this stone, all this architecture of power, Victoria was lonely. Not in the dramatic sense, not weeping in towers, but lonely in the way that very public, very powerful people often are, surrounded constantly by people whose relationship to her was defined by their position and hers, where genuine ease was almost impossible because everyone was always performing something. And then, in the middle of all this, was Harriet. Her name was Harriet Elizabeth Georgiana Howard. She was the Duchess of Sutherland, one of the wealthiest and most socially prominent women in Britain. Her husband's family controlled vast tracts of land in Scotland. These Sutherland estates covered nearly 1 million acres of the Northern Highlands, a scale of land ownership almost impossible to imagine. She moved through Victorian society with a kind of effortless authority that came not just from her position, but from who she clearly was, a woman of warmth, intelligence, and very strong opinions. And from the very beginning of Victoria's reign, she served as Mistress of the Robes, the most senior woman in the royal household, responsible for overseeing the Queen's wardrobe and her closest female attendants. Now, Mistress of the Robes sounds ceremonial. It sounds like a title you'd give someone to honour them rather than to use them. It sounds like the Victorian equivalent of a ribbon cutting. It was not. Here is what it actually meant. The Mistress of the Robes was, in practice, the person most responsible for the Queen's immediate environment. She organised the ladies of the bedchamber and the women of the bedchamber, the women who attended Victoria at the most intimate, most personal moments of her daily life, who dressed her, who sat with her during the long, formal hours of official engagements, who were present during the private hours that no ministers or ambassadors or prime ministers ever saw. Think about that for a moment. The women around a monarch in those private hours are not invisible. They are present. They are observing. They are hearing things. And they are, in the quiet intervals of daily life, talking. They are the last voices the Queen hears before sleep, the first faces she sees in the morning, the companions through the long domestic hours between public engagements, when the performance of monarchy pauses and something more human takes its place. And Harriet, who chose these women, who oversaw their behaviour, who was herself the senior presence in those private rooms, was a woman of considerable intelligence, strong political opinions, and deep personal loyalty to the Queen. She was also, by almost every account left by those who knew her, exceptionally warm, genuinely warm, not the professional warmth of a courtier performing closeness, real warmth. The kind that Victoria, who was in many ways isolated by her position and deeply prone to loneliness, responded to with an openness she rarely showed to anyone else. The conservatory at Windsor. Imagine it on a winter afternoon in the early 1840s, the glass roof filtering grey light onto deep green tropical plants, palms, ferns, broadleaf things from warmer parts of the world. The air in there was different from the rest of the castle, softer, heavier, faintly humid. It smelled of damp earth and something floral, something you couldn't quite name. In the middle of a cold English winter, it felt almost miraculous. This pocket of warmth, this transplanted fragment of somewhere tropical and alive, sitting inside a medieval fortress in Berkshire. Victoria loved her conservatory. It was one of the places where the official machinery of monarchy fell away, and she could simply exist for a moment, where the stone walls of Windsor were replaced by glass, and glass let in the sky, and the sky reminded you that there was a world beyond all this ceremony, and Harriet was often there with her. They would walk together slowly among the plants. They would talk. Not always about important things, and sometimes about very important things indeed. About the household, about the ladies, about Albert's opinions on various matters, about political appointments that had been suggested and whether they seemed wise, about which ministers Victoria found difficult and why, about the children once they started arriving, about the strange and specific loneliness of being the most famous woman in the world. Harriet listened. Harriet remembered. Harriet was thoughtful in her responses, and, here is the critical thing, Harriet had her own views, specific, considered views, built from decades of engagement with the political world through her own family connections and social position. She was not simply a mirror reflecting the Queen's feelings back at her. She was a mind engaging with another mind. I find that detail quietly significant, because so much of what we imagine about women near power in this era is that they were reflective, agreeable, supportive without being directive. And while many were, the most influential ones, Harriet among them, were distinguished precisely by the fact that they were not simply agreeable. They brought substance to the conversation. Here is something that most people never really think about when they consider the Victorian monarchy. Queen Victoria was not simply a symbolic figurehead. The monarch in this period had real, specific, constitutionally significant power. The Queen had the right to be consulted on every cabinet appointment. She had the right to be informed of every major political development before it became public. She had genuine influence over the direction of British foreign policy, and she exercised it, sometimes to the deep frustration of her ministers, who found her opinions inconveniently strong. This matters for our story because it means that whoever had the Queen's ear had access to something genuinely consequential, not advisory access, not symbolic access, actual working political influence. And Harriet, who spent more intimate hours with Victoria than almost any other person outside the immediate royal family, was one of the people best positioned to shape what the Queen thought, what she felt, which concerns she raised with her ministers, which appointments she favoured and which she resisted. None of this was direct. None of it was documented in the way that a cabinet meeting is documented. It happened in conservatories and dressing rooms and on walks in the grounds, in the intervals between official engagements, in the soft, unrecorded hours of daily life. But it was real. There is a particular episode in 1839, just before our story proper begins, in the final months of Melbourne's government. That shows exactly how consequential this kind of influence could be. It was called the bedchamber crisis, and it very nearly brought down a government. When Robert Peel was asked to form a ministry after Melbourne's resignation, he requested, as was standard practice, that the Queen replace her Whig ladies of the bedchamber with Tory ladies, as a signal of political confidence in the new administration. Victoria refused, flatly, absolutely, with a firmness that startled everyone around her, including Melbourne, who had advised a more cautious approach. She wrote to Peel directly. She was 18 years old. She'd been Queen for less than 2 years, and she held her ground. Peel refused to form a government under those conditions, Melbourne was recalled. The Whigs returned to office. The entire episode turned on the Queen's unwillingness to part with the women around her. Women she trusted. Women she had grown close to. Women who were, for the most part, connected to the Whig families that had surrounded her since childhood. Historians debate the extent to which Victoria was advised in her refusal. Some believe it was her own genuine instinct. Some believe Melbourne guided her. Some believe the ladies themselves, including Harriet, communicated subtly and powerfully that their removal would be felt as a personal slight and political betrayal. We cannot know for certain, but here is what we do know. The episode demonstrated unmistakably that the women of the royal household were not politically neutral. They had affiliations, they had loyalties, they had, through their proximity to the Queen, a form of political significance that no one could quite categorize, but no one could safely ignore. That was not accidental, and Harriet, who would go on to serve as Mistress of the Robes 3 separate times over the course of Victoria's reign, under 3 different governments, understood it better than anyone. There is something about the relationship between Victoria and Harriet that I want to linger on for a moment, because it is, at its heart, a story about friendship, real friendship, the kind that is harder to find the more powerful you become, because the more powerful you become, the less certain you can be that the people around you are genuinely fond of you, rather than simply useful to you. Victoria knew this. She felt it acutely. She wrote about it in her journals, the loneliness of the throne, the difficulty of trusting, the way that the formality of her position created a kind of glass wall between herself and the ordinary warmth of human connection. Harriet, for reasons that seem to have been genuinely personal rather than strategic, was one of the people who got through that wall. Their correspondence, and they wrote to each other throughout Victoria's reign, warm, personal, sometimes funny letters, is one of the small treasures of Victorian social history. Victoria wrote to Harriet about her children, about Albert, about her anxieties, about her opinions of people, stated with a bluntness she rarely risked in her official communications. She wrote to Harriet about how she felt, not just what she thought. That is a significant distinction for a woman whose official life required her to maintain enormous emotional control at almost all times. And Harriet wrote back with matching frankness. I find something in that genuinely touching, not because it was politically significant, though it was, but because it was human. 2 women, enormously different in their circumstances and separated by the vast formality of the court, finding in each other something that the official machinery of Victorian life made very difficult to find. Genuine ease, genuine trust, genuine affection. The conservatory light is fading. Afternoon has given way to the particular grey-blue of a winter evening at Windsor. Through the glass roof you can see the grounds darkening, the trees becoming shapes rather than individual things, the sky settling into the deep charcoal of a long, cold night. Inside it is still warm, the plants are still green, the air is still soft and faintly fragrant. A servant has come quietly in and lit the lamps. Not many, just enough to fill the space with a low amber glow that catches the leaves and the glass and the frost forming on the outside of the panes. And Victoria and Harriet are still talking. Whatever they are saying now, in this imagined quiet late afternoon, it is not for the official record, it is not for the newspapers, or the cabinet minutes, or the diplomatic dispatches. It is just conversation, the kind that matters most, the kind that changes how a person thinks without them being able to point precisely to the moment of change. This is the 3rd form of power we've encountered tonight. Not the power of the guest list, not the power of the negotiating table, but the power of proximity, of presence, of being genuinely, personally trusted by the person who holds the most significant position in the land. It is the quietest form of all the kinds we'll discuss tonight, and in some ways it is the deepest. But there is another kind of power entirely that we haven't yet explored, one that operated not in the drawing room or the conservatory or the grand houses of Mayfair, but in the streets of London itself, in the hospitals and the workhouses and the back alleys and the river-facing tenements where the city's poor lived and too often died. A power that was exercised not through social position but through money. Enormous, strategic, deliberately deployed money. Her name was Angela, and she built a different kind of empire entirely. That story is exactly where we're headed next. In 1837, a young woman named Angela Burdett inherited a sum of money so large that it changed the nature of her life overnight. She was 23 years old. She'd been living quietly, comfortably, in a world of moderate wealth and moderate social expectation. A clever woman, a well-read woman, a woman of genuine feeling and sharp observation, but not yet a woman of consequence, not in any public sense, and then, in a single moment, she became the richest woman in England. The bequest came from her grandfather, Thomas Coutts, founder of the Coutts banking dynasty. The Coutts Bank had, by this point, been the bank of the royal family for generations. It was one of the most prestigious financial institutions in the country. The fortune passed through Thomas's second wife, Harriet Mellon, a former actress of considerable shrewdness, who had married the elderly Thomas Coutts and been left the bulk of his estate on his death. Harriet had no children of her own. She looked at the Burdett family and chose Angela, thoughtful, serious, clearly capable, above all the others. The sum was somewhere in the region of £1.8 million. In the money of today, that is approximately £200 million, perhaps more, perhaps considerably more when you account for what money could actually do in a society that had no welfare state, no public health system, no universal education. Think about that for a moment. 23 years old, £200 million, in a society that did not allow women to vote, did not allow women to sit in Parliament, and would not allow women to enter most professional institutions for another 50 years. Angela Burdett-Coutts, she would take the hyphenated name as a condition of the inheritance, suddenly had more practical economic power than almost any individual in the country. More than most members of Parliament, more than most lords, more than most industrialists who'd spent their entire careers building their fortunes. And she spent the next 60 years figuring out exactly what to do with it. The study on the upper floor of her house in Stratton Street, Mayfair, was not a grand room by the standards of the era, but it was a working room. Let me place you inside it for a moment. The desk is wide and practical, not the delicate writing tables that fashionable Victorian ladies used for their correspondence, but a real working desk, the kind built for serious use. The surface is covered with papers, always with papers. There are account books, letters, maps, sometimes, of neighbourhood she's investigating. The East End, the docks, particular parishes in South London or the Midlands where conditions have been brought to her attention, and she is deciding whether to act. On the walls are bookshelves, floor to ceiling on two sides of the room. The books are not decorative. They've been read. Many of them have been marked. There are pamphlets stacked on top of the shelves, where the shelves have run out of space. Government reports, commission findings, population surveys. Angela read them all. She had staff to help her manage the volume. She had advisers. She corresponded extensively with Charles Dickens, who became one of her closest friends and who shared her particular horror at the conditions of London's poor, and with the Duke of Wellington, who'd been a mentor and something like a paternal figure to her in her early years. She corresponded with bishops, with engineers, with architects, with doctors, with missionaries in West Africa and social reformers in the East End. But the decisions were hers. Every significant charitable investment Angela Burdett-Coutts made was the result of her own judgment, her own research, and her own strategic thinking about where money could be most effectively deployed. She did not give grants to supplicants. She designed interventions. She identified problems, thought through solutions, and built the institutions she believed would address them most durably. And here is the thing about how she thought about it. Angela did not consider charity to be simply kindness. She was kind, genuinely, personally kind, but she understood that kindness without strategy was just sentiment. Money thrown at problems without careful thought about what would actually change, what would actually last, was not generosity. It was self-satisfaction. It made the giver feel better without making anything meaningfully different. What she wanted, what she worked toward, methodically across decades, was change, structural change, the kind of change that persisted after the money was spent and the founding energy had faded. She built churches, not as acts of piety alone, but because she understood that in Victorian working-class communities, the church was the only institution that touched daily life at every point: education, welfare, community, moral framework. Build a good church in a poor neighbourhood with a capable vicar and a school attached, and you had built a small civilizational anchor. You had given a community somewhere to be, someone to call on, children somewhere to learn. The church was infrastructure. Angela built it as infrastructure. She funded drinking fountains. That sounds small. It is not. In mid-Victorian London, access to clean drinking water was genuinely a matter of life and death. The great cholera epidemics of the 1840s and 1850s had demonstrated catastrophically what happened when poor communities had no reliable source of clean water. John Snow's famous work mapping the Broad Street outbreak in 1854 was still fresh in scientific memory. Angela's drinking fountains were installed across London and across British cities, hundreds of them. They were used daily by people who had no other source of water that was not contaminated by the city's overwhelmed and leaking sewers. They saved lives, measurably, documentably saved lives. She built Columbia Market, a grand covered market in Bethnal Green, intended to give the street traders of the East End a permanent, dignified home. The market itself ultimately failed, for complex social reasons related to how the East End's economy worked, and how the traders moved through it. But the ambition behind it, to bring infrastructure and dignity to the poorest working people in London, to treat their commerce as something worth housing properly, was entirely characteristic of how Angela thought. She funded the Bishopsgate Institute. She supported ragged schools, free schools for children who were too poor, too dirty, too barefoot to be admitted to the regular parish schools. She invested in model housing, working with architects to design dwellings that were sanitary and decent and affordable. She established a vocational training program for women who had fallen into destitution. She funded expeditions to map parts of Africa. She funded the rebuilding of fishing communities in Ireland after the famine had destroyed them. None of this was random. None of it was impulsive. Every project was chosen because Angela had looked at the landscape of need and asked, not simply where is there suffering, but where can money create lasting change? Where is the gap that no one else is filling? Where will an investment compound into something that outlasts the investment itself? Here is what most people miss about Angela Burdett-Coutts. They see the charity and they think, generous woman, wealthy woman doing good works, a Victorian philanthropist, which is to say, a very comfortable person giving away some of what they had in order to feel better about having it. That is not what she was. What she was, and this is the detail that changes everything, was a policymaker who had no access to official policy. She could not sit in Parliament. She could not hold government office. She could not draft legislation or instruct a ministry or direct the spending of public funds. But she had £200 million. And in a world where the Victorian state provided almost nothing, where there was no national health service, no universal education, no unemployment support, no public housing, no welfare system in any meaningful sense, private money deployed strategically could function as policy in its own right. Angela understood this with a precision that was almost unsettling. She did not simply give to existing charities, she identified gaps. She looked at the map of provision, what existed, what was funded, what was working, and she found the places where nothing existed at all, where a strategic investment could create an institution that would outlast its founder and go on doing work indefinitely. That is not charity. That is urban planning. That is social policy. That is the exercise of judgment about how a city should function and what a government should provide and where the most urgent human needs are located. She just did it with her own money because she wasn't allowed to do it any other way. There is a particular project I want to tell you about. In the 1840s, Angela and Charles Dickens began working together on something they called Urania Cottage. It was a home, a small, carefully managed home in Shepherd's Bush, for women who had been imprisoned, or who had worked as prostitutes, or who had fallen into destitution and could find no other way out of it. The goal was simple and radical. Give these women a period of stability, care, education and practical training. Then help them emigrate somewhere, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, where the stigma of their past would not follow them and where they could build something new. Dickens managed the day-to-day operations. He interviewed prospective residents. He dealt with crises when they arose. He wrote the admission procedures. Angela funded it. But Angela was also deeply involved in its design, in the philosophy of how to run such a place, what to offer, how to treat the women who came there, how to balance the Victorian instinct toward moral correction with the genuine human need for dignity and opportunity. The letters between Dickens and Angela about Urania Cottage are remarkable documents. They show two people who disagreed about some things and agreed deeply about others, working through the genuine difficulty of trying to change individual lives in a society that offered very few second chances. Dickens was sometimes impatient. Angela was more methodical. He wanted results. She wanted the right conditions for results to be possible. I find something in that quietly moving. Not the Victorian earnestness of the project, though I understand the impulse, but the seriousness of it. The refusal to treat the women who came to Urania Cottage as problems to be managed rather than people to be helped. That refusal came from Angela, back in the study on Stratton Street. The lamp is lit. The stack of letters on the desk is, if anything, taller than it was this morning. Outside, the street sounds drift up. Horses on cobblestones, the distant cry of a vendor, the rumble of a cart. The ordinary music of Victorian London going about its relentless business. Angela picks up her pen. She reads the next letter carefully. It is from a parish priest in a neighbourhood she doesn't know well. Somewhere east, somewhere poor, somewhere where the children are not in school and the adults are not in work and the streets are in a state that the newspapers would describe, if they described them at all, as deplorable. She considers. She makes a note. She adds it to the pile for further investigation. Then she moves to the next one. This is not glamorous. There's nothing romantic about this image. A woman at a desk, reading letters, taking notes, thinking carefully about where money should go. There are no grand speeches, no dramatic confrontations, no moments that would look well in a painting. But across the 60 years of her active philanthropic life, those letters and those decisions and those investments changed the material conditions of tens of thousands of lives in the East End, in Ireland, in West Africa, in the Australian colonies, in the ragged schools and the model dwellings and the drinking fountains and the small, careful, lasting institutions she built from the ground up. She was made a baroness in 1871, the first woman ever to receive a peerage in her own right, for her own achievements, rather than as the widow or daughter of a man who'd held a title. Queen Victoria herself pressed for it. It was a remarkable recognition, a partial one. She was still not permitted to sit in the House of Lords as a full member, but remarkable. She died in 1906. She had outlived the Victorian era itself by 5 years, and the institution she had built was still there, still running, still doing the work she had designed them to do. Not a speech, not a bill, not a seat in Parliament, just money, thought, patience, and an insistence that the world could be arranged differently than it currently was. That, too, is power. The fire in the drawing room has settled into its evening rhythm now. Not the bright, crackling fire of early evening, but the steady, deep glow of a fire that has been burning for hours and has found its quiet pace. The rain outside is gentler than it was, or perhaps you've simply grown used to it. That happens, doesn't it? You stop noticing the rain when you've been inside long enough. It becomes part of the room, part of the atmosphere, part of the background music of a long, comfortable evening. We've moved through 3 kinds of power tonight. The power of the salon, the power of the royal household, the power of private wealth strategically deployed. But there is a 4th kind that operated even further from the official record, in the literal shadows of the era, in the letters that were never signed, in the articles that appeared under men's names, in the pamphlets, and the criticism and the political commentary that shaped public opinion across the whole Victorian period. Women who wrote, not novels, though there were those too, but arguments, journalism, political analysis, social critique, women who shaped what Victorian England thought without anyone knowing it was a woman who had shaped it. Their story is the next one we step into, and it is, I think, the most quietly astonishing of all. There is a small attic room near the top of a tall terraced house somewhere in central London. The ceiling slopes on one side following the pitch of the roof. There is a single window, narrow, set low, looking out across a jumble of chimneys and rooftops. On a clear day you can see a long way from that window. On a day like today, grey, rain-washed, the sky the colour of old pewter, you can see the smoke rising from 1,000 London fires, blurring together into a soft haze over the city. The room is not comfortable in the way that drawing rooms and conservatories are comfortable. There is a small fireplace, but the fire in it is modest, just enough to keep the chill off, not enough to make the room warm in any generous sense. There is a shawl over the back of the chair. The desk is positioned as close to the window as possible, to catch the last of the afternoon light before it fades. There are bookshelves, a great many bookshelves, every shelf filled and a second row of smaller volumes stacked in front of the first. There are newspapers, stacks of them, current ones and older ones folded and annotated in the margins with tight, precise handwriting. Someone has been through these newspapers very carefully, has been reading them not as a casual reader reads, but as a professional reads, looking for gaps, for arguments inadequately made, for positions that could be challenged, for questions that no one has yet thought to ask. At the desk by the window, a woman is writing. She has been writing for several hours. The lamp on the desk is lit, not because the afternoon is dark, but because the window does not provide quite enough light for the work, and the work matters too much to do in poor light. She is writing a political article, a serious one, about the Reform Bill, or about the Irish question, or about the conditions of the industrial working class, or about Britain's foreign policy in the Crimea, or about one of a dozen other urgent questions that occupied the thinking public of mid-Victorian England. It is written with precision, with command, with the kind of authority that comes from having read deeply and thought hard for a very long time. And at the top of the piece, where her name should be, she is going to write something else. A man's name, a pseudonym, an invention, or she will write nothing at all. The Victorian literary and journalistic world had a strange relationship with anonymity. Anonymous publication was common across the whole period, not just for women, but for men too. Many of the great journals of the era, the Edinburgh Review, the Quarterly Review, Fraser's Magazine, the Westminster Review, published their articles without bylines as a matter of editorial policy. The idea was that the argument should stand on its own, independent of the author's identity and reputation. In theory, this should have been liberating for women writers. In practice, it was more complicated than that, because while anonymity removed the question of gender from the published work itself, it did not remove it from the world in which the writer had to operate. A woman who wanted to write for one of the great reviews still had to convince an editor, almost always a man, to commission her or accept her submission. She still had to negotiate payment. She still had to build a reputation, even if that reputation was only known to a small circle of editors and literary insiders. She still, in short, had to operate in a professional world that had not been designed for her. And the women who succeeded in that world, who built careers, who shaped opinion, who made real intellectual contributions to the great debates of their era, found ways to do it that were, in their own way, as creative and as strategically sophisticated as anything we've discussed tonight. Let me tell you about Harriet Martineau. She was born in 1802 in Norwich, the sixth child of a fabric merchant. The family was educated, Unitarian, and moderately comfortable. But it was not wealthy. It was not aristocratic. There was no salon to inherit, no banking fortune, no connection to the royal household. What Harriet had was a mind like a very precise instrument, and an absolute refusal to accept that being a woman meant being excluded from the serious intellectual life of her time. She began writing in her 20s, essays, stories, articles. She wrote to supplement the family income after her father's business failed, and she wrote because she could not imagine doing anything else with the energy that was in her. She'd grown up partially deaf. She wore an ear trumpet throughout her adult life, in a household that valued ideas and argument, and she had formed opinions, strong and specific ones, about almost everything. And then, in 1832, she published a series of short books called Illustrations of Political Economy, 25 volumes, over 3 years, each one a short, readable narrative illustrating the principles of economic theory. The kind of thing that Ricardo and Mill wrote in dense academic prose that was accessible only to specialists, only to people who had already been trained in the vocabulary and the reasoning of formal economics. Harriet wrote it as story, as drama, as the kind of thing that a person with no formal education in economics could read and understand and find genuinely illuminating. The series sold extraordinarily well, tens of thousands of copies. It was read by people who had never read a book about economics before in their lives. It was read by artisans and tradespeople and members of Parliament. It was read by members of the general public who had previously found the great economic questions of the age — free trade, protectionism, the Corn Laws, the nature of wages and poverty — completely impenetrable. Harriet Martineau had made those questions accessible. She had translated the specialist discourse of professional economists into something that ordinary people could follow and care about. And in doing so, she had changed the shape of the public conversation about all of those things. It made her famous. It also made her politically influential in ways that no formal political career could have matched. Because here is the thing about public opinion. Public opinion is not shaped in Parliament. Parliament responds to public opinion, or ignores it, or lags behind it, but does not create it. Public opinion is shaped in the spaces where ordinary people encounter ideas. In the newspapers, the books, the conversations, the sermons, the letters and the pamphlets that circulate through a society and gradually shift what people believe is possible and what they believe is true. Harriet Martineau, at her peak, had more direct access to that process than almost any politician alive. She wrote for the major newspapers. She wrote for the major reviews. She was consulted by politicians and civil servants. She visited America in the 1830s, at a time when very few British intellectuals were paying serious attention to American society, and wrote an analysis called Society in America, published in 1837. That was one of the sharpest, most perceptive sociological texts of the century. She looked at American democracy with a clear eye and saw both its promise and its profound contradictions, particularly around slavery, and she said so, in print, clearly and without equivocation, at a time when many of her contemporaries preferred to avoid the subject. She never held an official position. She never had a vote. But when she wrote, the country read. She was not alone. Harriet Martineau was the most famous of a substantial cohort of Victorian women who shaped public thought through writing, often pseudonymously, often anonymously, always against the resistance of a professional culture that would have preferred they stay quiet or confine themselves to domestic subjects. There was George Eliot, you may know that name. Her real name was Mary Ann Evans, born in 1819 in Warwickshire, the daughter of a land agent. She wrote under a male pseudonym for a reason she explained quite directly. She wanted to be taken seriously, and in the Victorian literary world a woman's name on a work of serious fiction was, for many editors and critics, a signal to read it with reduced expectations. Her novels, Middlemarch, The Mill on the Floss, Adam Bede, Silas Marner, were not lightweight. They were among the most morally serious and intellectually rigorous works of prose fiction produced in any language in the 19th century. Henry James, who was not easily impressed, called Middlemarch one of the few English novels written for adults. The American poet Emily Dickinson read George Eliot throughout her life and considered her one of the great minds of the age. But George Eliot was also, less famously, a working journalist and critic before she became a novelist. She wrote for the Westminster Review, one of the most important intellectual journals of the mid-Victorian era, and she eventually became its de facto editor, doing most of the practical editorial work while her editor, John Chapman, took the public credit. She translated major German philosophical texts into English: Feuerbach's Essence of Christianity, Strauss's Life of Jesus, works that had a significant and lasting influence on Victorian religious thought and the great Victorian crisis of faith that ran through the second half of the century. She did not translate them as Mary Ann Evans. For years, her intellectual contributions were either anonymous or attributed to other names. Think about what that means. A woman whose contribution to Victorian intellectual culture was vast and deep and lasting, and who spent the first half of her career making that contribution without her own name attached to it. It strikes me as simultaneously inspiring and quietly devastating. Inspiring because she found the way through. Devastating because there had to be a way through at all. There was also Eliza Lynn Linton, less remembered now, but hugely influential in her time. She was one of the first women to be employed as a salaried journalist on a British newspaper. The Morning Chronicle hired her in 1848, paying her a regular salary, which was extremely unusual for a woman at that period. She went on to write prolifically for the Saturday Review and a dozen other publications, building a career that was, by any measure, remarkable. What makes her story complicated is this. Many of Eliza Lynn Linton's most widely read articles were attacks on what she called the girl of the period, her phrase, and it became famous, echoed and argued about across the press for years. The girl of the period was, in Linton's description, the modern, emancipated, fashion-conscious young woman who rejected Victorian feminine convention in favour of independence, personal ambition, and the company of men on more or less equal terms. Linton did not approve. She wrote against women's suffrage. She wrote against women's professional ambitions. She wrote, sometimes with real venom, against the very freedom she herself had been among the first to exercise. I want to be honest about that, because it is easy and tempting and deeply misleading to tell the story of Victorian women's influence as a simple story of progress, of brave women quietly advancing toward the light, pushing against the darkness, moving history forward one careful step at a time. It wasn't that. Or at least, it wasn't only that. Some of the most articulate and influential female voices of the Victorian era were deployed against women's equality. Some of the sharpest pens were aimed at the women who wanted things to change. The story is messier and more human than the triumphant version allows. Eliza Lynn Linton is a vivid example of the paradox. A woman who achieved, through her own talent and audacity, a career that no woman was supposed to have, and who then used that career to argue that other women shouldn't want such things. That is, it seems to me, both deeply confusing and entirely human. We contain contradictions. We always have. The attic room is very quiet now. The woman at the desk has set down her pen. The article is done, or done enough for tonight. Outside, the rain has eased, not stopped. It never quite stops in this kind of London evening, but settled into something lighter, softer. The chimneys are still smoking. The city is still out there, vast and restless, and entirely indifferent to the small, careful work that has been happening in this room all afternoon. She folds the pages, addresses them. Tomorrow they will go to an editor. He will read them, make some changes perhaps, argue about the ending. If he accepts them, and she has reason to believe he will, they will appear in print within the week, and her name will not be on them, or a name will be there that is not quite her name. But her thinking will be there, her arguments, her analysis, her particular way of looking at the world and insisting that it could be understood more clearly, held to a higher standard, expected to do better. That will be there. In thousands of homes across England, people will read it with their breakfast, or in their drawing rooms after dinner, or in the reading rooms of the great clubs where women were not permitted to enter. They will think about what it says. Some of them will change their minds about something, even slightly, even imperceptibly. And that, in the end, is what writing is for, and that is what power is, at its most patient and most durable. The fire is warm, the room is quiet, the evening is deepening outside. We've been in this world for a while now. The salons and the conservatories and the charitable offices and the attic writing rooms. We've met women who change things through connection, through proximity, through money, through words. But there is one more world we need to visit before the evening draws to a close. A colder world, a more technical world, one that most people, when they think of the Victorian era, don't think of at all when they think of women. The world of science. Two women, in particular, who stood at the edge of the modern world and saw what was coming before almost anyone else, and whose influence on that future was enormous and almost entirely uncredited in their own lifetimes. One of them you may have heard of, the other one I suspect you haven't, but both of them belong in this story, and their room is the next one we enter. Somewhere in the 1830s, a small, modest house sits on the edge of a quiet English town. Inside, in a room that serves as both sitting room and study, a woman in her 50s is working. The room is tidy but well used. Books everywhere, papers in organised stacks, a globe on a side table, star charts pinned to a board above the writing desk. The window looks out onto a garden that is neglected in the pleasant way that gardens sometimes are when the person who owns them has too many other things to think about. On the desk, an open manuscript, hundreds of pages covered in close, careful handwriting, corrections in the margins, passages crossed out and rewritten, pages numbered and renumbered. The lamp is lit even though it is still afternoon, because the writing has gone on through the afternoon without stopping, and the afternoon has quietly become evening. This woman has been working for most of her adult life on a problem that has consumed her completely. The problem is how to explain the universe, not metaphorically, not theologically, literally, in the specific, quantifiable, mathematically precise language of natural philosophy, which is what Victorians called what we now call science. Her name is Mary Somerville, and at the moment we're imagining she is putting the finishing touches on a book called On the Connection of the Physical Sciences. It will be published in 1834. It will go through 10 editions in her lifetime. It will be translated into multiple European languages. It will be read by scientists, by students, by members of Parliament, by educated general readers throughout the English-speaking world. It will be, in the judgment of historians of science, one of the most important works of scientific synthesis produced in the 19th century. And when it is published, a great many people will be astonished to discover that its author is a woman. Here is what most people do not know about Mary Somerville. She was not formally educated, not in any meaningful sense. She was born in 1780 in Jedburgh, Scotland, into a naval family. Her father was a naval officer who was often away at sea. As a girl, she taught herself algebra from a puzzle in a fashion magazine. She spotted the symbols, recognized that they represented something systematic, and then set about on her own, learning what they meant. She taught herself from a fashion magazine at 11 years old. Think about that for a moment. Not because it is a charming detail, though it is, but because of what it tells you about the hunger behind it. A girl in 1780 Scotland, with no access to formal scientific education, no teacher, no institution willing to take her seriously, who saw a mathematical puzzle in a publication aimed at women's fashion and thought, I want to understand that. I want to understand it properly. And then did. Her father, when he discovered that she was studying mathematics, was alarmed. He feared it would damage her health. Her first husband, a naval officer named Samuel Greig, thought the whole enterprise inappropriate. He died young, and she described being widowed as one of the things that gave her freedom, not because she'd not loved him, but because widowhood removed a particular kind of obstruction. Her second husband was different. William Somerville was a physician who actively supported her work, helped her access scientific literature, introduced her to the right people, and essentially functioned as her research assistant as well as her husband. Their marriage, by all accounts, was a genuine intellectual partnership, one of the rarer kinds. Over the years that followed her first encounters with mathematics, Mary taught herself the whole landscape of the natural sciences as they existed in her time. Mathematics, astronomy, chemistry, geology, physics. She corresponded with the greatest scientists of the age, William Herschel, John Playfair, the great French mathematician Laplace himself. Laplace, who had little patience for intellectual lightweights, reviewed her translation of his Mécanique Céleste and described it as superior to the original in its clarity. Superior to the original. She was eventually elected an honorary member of the Royal Astronomical Society, one of the first women to receive that distinction. She could not become a full member. The Royal Astronomical Society did not admit women as full members. That rule would not change until 1916, 82 years after Mary published her greatest work. But she could be honorary. She could be consulted. She could write the books that full members assign to their students. She could shape what the next generation of scientists understood about the physical world. And she did. On the Connection of the Physical Sciences was not a textbook. It was something more ambitious and more unusual. It was an attempt to show how all the different branches of science, astronomy, geology, physics, meteorology, magnetism, were not separate, unrelated disciplines, but expressions of a single set of underlying laws. That the universe, examined from any direction, revealed the same deep grammar. That a scientist who truly understood one branch of natural knowledge would find, if they looked carefully enough, that it connected to every other branch. This is an idea we take for granted now. The unified field, the interconnectedness of scientific principles. We assume it so completely that we barely notice it. But in 1834, it was not obvious. Science was still largely organized as a collection of separate specialities, each with its own vocabulary, its own journals, its own community. A geologist and an astronomer might have very little to say to each other. Mary Somerville saw across those specialities. She saw the connections, and she wrote them down in prose clear enough for an educated general reader to follow, without sacrificing the precision that a scientist required. Here is a detail I want to linger on. It was a review of Mary Somerville's book, a review by the astronomer and polymath William Whewell, in which the word scientist was coined for the first time in print. Whewell was trying to find a word to describe people like Somerville, people who did not fit neatly into any single scientific discipline, not a mathematician, not an astronomer, not a geologist, but someone whose mind ranged with authority across all of these fields. He needed a new word. He invented it. Scientist. He invented the word scientist specifically because of her. That is not a small thing. The woman who cannot become a full member of the Royal Astronomical Society. The woman who taught herself algebra from a fashion magazine at 11 years old. The woman whose existence required the invention of a new word to describe what she was. Her name is Mary Somerville, and then there was her friend. She was younger, 30 years younger, and where Mary was steady and systematic and patient, She was volatile and brilliant and prone to the kind of thinking that moves so fast it sometimes outran her ability to record it. Her name was Augusta Ada King, Countess of Lovelace. You may know her simply as Ada Lovelace. Her father was Lord Byron, the poet, the most famous and most scandalous literary figure of his generation, the author of Childe Harold, Don Juan, the man whose personal life was so spectacular and so chaotic that it had become a kind of legend even while he was still alive. He died when Ada was 8 years old in Greece, trying to help in the Greek War of Independence. Ada never knew him. She grew up with her mother's version of him. Cautionary tale, romantic disaster, brilliant but uncontrollable, and with her mother's fierce determination that Ada would be nothing like him. Her mother, terrified of the chaos that had characterized her marriage to Byron, determined that Ada would be raised as far from poetry as possible. She would be educated in mathematics and logic. She would be trained in reason. Every tutor, every curriculum, every intellectual influence in Ada's childhood was chosen to develop the analytical, the precise, the rational. Ada's mother did not intend this as an act of liberation. She intended it as a form of protection. Rational thought, she believed, would inoculate her daughter against the romantic disorder that had destroyed her marriage. What it actually did was give Ada Lovelace a mind unlike almost anyone else's in Victorian England. Because Ada was not only a mathematician, she was a mathematician who could also think imaginatively, analogically, who could look at a technical system and see not just what it currently did, but what it might one day be capable of, who could hold the concrete and the abstract simultaneously, the engineering reality of a machine and the philosophical implications of what such a machine might mean. That combination was rare. It might be the rarest kind of mind. In 1843, Ada Lovelace translated a paper by the Italian mathematician Luigi Menabrea about Charles Babbage's analytical engine, Babbage's proposed mechanical computing machine, which he'd been designing for years, consuming significant government funding, and had never quite managed to build in its final form. Menabrea had written a description of the machine in French after attending one of Babbage's lectures in Turin. The translation itself was not the important thing. What Ada added to the translation was her notes, which were almost 3 times longer than the original paper, were the first description of what we would now recognize as a computer program. She described, in precise technical language, how the analytical engine could be instructed to perform not just arithmetic, but any operation that could be expressed symbolically. She described what we now call a loop, a set of instructions repeated multiple times. She described what we now call a subroutine, a set of instructions that could be called upon as needed within a larger program. She described the machine as capable of doing things its inventor had not imagined. Babbage thought of the analytical engine as a very powerful calculator. Extraordinary, yes, but fundamentally a machine for computation. Ada saw it as something else entirely. She saw it as a machine that could, in principle, manipulate any symbolic information. Not just numbers, but musical notes, letters, any system of symbols that had a logical structure. A machine that did not merely calculate, but that processed. She was describing in 1843 the conceptual foundation of the general-purpose computer. The computer you use today, the telephone in your pocket, the whole digital architecture of the modern world, the servers and the networks and the programs and the operating systems and the applications through which you live, an increasing portion of your daily life. Its conceptual origin is in a set of notes written by a 27-year-old woman in 1843, who saw something that her male colleagues could not quite see, and wrote it down with enough precision that 100 years later, when the engineers building actual computers were looking for a theoretical foundation, they found it in Ada's notes. Think about that. There is a detail about Ada Lovelace's life that I find quietly heartbreaking. She died at 36 years old, cervical cancer, 1852. She died before the analytical engine was ever built, before any of the ideas in those famous notes could be tested against a real machine, before anyone could say, with confidence, whether she had been right. She had been right, but she never knew it. Babbage, who outlived her by 19 years, kept her portrait in his study for the rest of his life. He described their collaboration as one of the great intellectual experiences of his life. She had in those notes seen further than he had. He knew it. He said so. He called her the enchantress of numbers. But Ada Lovelace died at 36, and her notes were forgotten, quietly, gradually, in the way that things written by women tended to be forgotten in the Victorian era, until the 20th century, when the history of computing began to be reconstructed, and historians went looking for its origins, and found her. I want to come back to Mary Somerville for a moment before we leave this room, because there is something in the arc of her life that I find genuinely beautiful. She was born in 1780. She died in 1872. She lived to 91 years old, and she was working until the very end. Her autobiography, Personal Recollections, was published the year after she died. She was working on a paper about mathematics, a technical mathematical paper, serious work, when she died. 91 years old, still working. In the last years of her life, living in Naples, she had a study overlooking the bay. The light there in the morning was extraordinary, clear and warm and entirely different from the grey, rain-soaked light of England. The Bay of Naples is one of the most beautiful things in the world, and she saw it every morning through her study window, and then she turned to her desk and worked. She wrote to a friend near the end of her life, "I am not conscious of any decay of my faculties." I find that detail quietly magnificent. Not the absence of decay, but the fact that she kept going, that the work was to the end what she was for, not the recognition, though recognition had come, not the honorary memberships and the honorary degrees, not the colleges named after her. Somerville College at Oxford was founded in 1879 and named in her honour, a college that would go on to educate some of the most remarkable women of the 20th century. The work itself, the thinking, the continuous lifelong effort to understand the world more precisely. The observatory is dark now. The dome is open to the night sky, and through it the stars are visible, cold and brilliant and impossibly distant. The brass instruments catch the starlight and hold it for a moment before releasing it. In here, it smells of old wood and machine oil, and the slightly metallic cold of a space where the outside air is always finding its way in. The kind of cold that is clean and sharp and focuses the mind rather than dulling it. The work of the women in this room, Mary Somerville and Ada Lovelace and the others who worked near them and around them, and often uncredited beside them, was work of a particular kind of courage. Not social courage, not the courage of the salon or the drawing room, where the rules were clear even if they were unjust. This was the courage of seeing something true and saying it out loud in a room that was not designed for you, where the equipment was not built for your hands and the journals were not open to your name, and the institutions were not prepared to acknowledge that what you were doing was science in the fullest sense, and doing it anyway, with rigour, with precision, with a refusal to be anything less than completely serious about the work. The stars don't care who is looking at them. The mathematics doesn't care who is writing it down. The truth has no preference for the gender of the person who discovers it. That is the room we've been sitting in for the last part of this story, and it is a room that connects directly to the world you're living in right now. The evening is not over, and the most important part of the story, the part about what all of these women taken together actually meant, that part is waiting for us still. There is a lamp burning in a hospital corridor. It is late, long past the hour when visitors are admitted and the wards are quiet in the particular way that hospitals at night are quiet. Not peaceful, exactly, but still. A contained, watchful stillness. The patients who are sleeping are sleeping. The patients who are not sleeping are lying with their eyes open in the dark, listening to the small sounds of the building around them, footsteps somewhere distant, the creak of a wooden floor, the low moan of a man in the next bed lost in some private pain. The corridor itself is long. The walls are stone. The floor is stone. The smell is the smell of every hospital of this era. Carbolic and unwashed linen, and something metallic underneath it all that you do not want to think about too hard. And along the corridor, moving slowly, a woman carries the lamp. She's checking on the men in the beds. She's done this every night since she arrived. She will do it every night until she leaves. She does not do it because it has been assigned to her, or because someone has asked her to. She does it because she has understood something that the military and medical establishment around her has not yet understood. She has understood that the men in these beds are dying not from their wounds, but from what happens after their wounds, from infection, from contamination, from the conditions of the hospital itself, the overcrowding, the absence of ventilation, the water supply that runs too close to the drains, the floors that cannot be properly cleaned, the sheer accumulated filth of a building that was not designed as a hospital and that no one has yet adequately reconsidered. And she has a plan to change that. Her name is Florence Nightingale. Most people know the lamp. Most people know the image. The lady with the lamp, moving through the wards of Scutari during the Crimean War. The compassionate nurse. The woman who went where women were not supposed to go and cared for men that the official system had largely abandoned. It is an image so familiar, so settled into British cultural memory, that it has become almost impossible to look at it freshly. It is a true image, but it is also an incomplete one, because Florence Nightingale was not primarily a nurse, in the emotional sense that the Victorian image suggests. She was not defined by her bedside manner or her personal warmth, though she had both. She was not the selfless angel of Victorian hagiography, generous and gentle and self-sacrificing, and otherwise uncomplicated. What she was primarily was a statistician, and a bureaucrat of extraordinary talent. Those two words, statistician and bureaucrat, do not sound like the words of a revolutionary. They sound like the words of someone who fills in forms. They do not inspire. They do not move. There is no poetry in them. But in Florence Nightingale's hands, statistics and bureaucracy were the most powerful weapons she had access to, and she used them with a precision that changed the British Army's medical system, the structure of British hospitals, and the practice of public health in ways that are still visible today. Here is what happened at Scutari. When Florence Nightingale arrived at the Barrack Hospital in November 1854, the mortality rate among the wounded soldiers was catastrophic. Men were dying at a rate that had no military justification. They were dying not from the wounds they had received in battle, not from the decisions of enemy commanders, but from preventable infections, from contaminated water, from overcrowding, from a building that was essentially constructed on top of its own sewers and whose drains backed up into the wards. The smell was, by every account, appalling. She could see this. She had eyes. Any attentive person who walked into those wards could see that something was badly wrong. But seeing is not the same as proving, and proving is not the same as changing. Florence Nightingale understood this distinction with a clarity that was, in the context of the 1850s, almost unprecedented. She did not simply observe the problem, she measured it. She collected data, death rates, cause of death, timing, location within the hospital, correlation with sanitary conditions. She tracked mortality by week, by ward, by season. She organized the data into tables, precise, careful, comparable tables that showed not just what the death rate was, but how it changed under different conditions and in different parts of the hospital. And then she did something that had almost never been done in the history of medical or military statistics. She made the data visible. She invented, or at least substantially developed, what we now call the polar area diagram, sometimes called the coxcomb chart after her. A circular graphic representation of data, divided into wedge-shaped sections where the area of each section corresponds to a number, arranged so that the whole picture could be understood at a glance, by anyone, regardless of whether they had any statistical training. It was an act of visual communication of extraordinary sophistication. The charts showed, unmistakably, clearly, undeniably, that the soldiers were dying not from battle wounds but from preventable disease caused by the conditions of their environment. The blue wedge, preventable disease, dwarfed the red wedge, battle wounds, in every month she plotted. There was no other conclusion a viewer could draw. She sent these charts to the War Office. She sent them to members of Parliament. She sent them to journalists she had carefully cultivated, and who she knew would use them well. She sent them to the Queen. People looked at the charts and understood immediately what had been happening. Not just what it meant in theory, not just as an abstract policy question, but what it actually looked like, the shape of the catastrophe, rendered in colour, in a form that anyone could grasp. And things began to change. The Sanitary Commission that was sent to Scutari in February 1855, partly in response to the political pressure Florence had helped to generate, flushed the sewers, improved the ventilation, cleared the hospital of the accumulated filth. Within months, the mortality rate fell dramatically, from over 40% in February 1855 to around 2% by June. She'd been right. The data had been right. The deaths had been preventable. Think about what it took to demonstrate that. Not just the insight, though the insight was real and significant. The data collection, the careful organization, the invention of a visual form that made the argument irresistible, the strategic distribution of the charts to the people who could act on them. Every step of that process was deliberate, skilled, and executed with a kind of cold professional precision that had nothing to do with the sentimental image of the lamp-carrying nurse. Here is the detail that I find most striking about Florence Nightingale's life and career. She spent most of it in bed. After the Crimea, she returned to England in August 1856, physically destroyed. What she had contracted, what she suffered from for the rest of her life, we cannot diagnose with certainty across 170 years. Brucellosis is the most common suggestion. A severe psychosomatic condition is another, perhaps both, together. She had gone to Scutari at 34 years old in vigorous health. She came back at 36, an invalid. For the next 30 years she rarely left her rooms. She lay on a couch. She received visitors lying down, carefully rationing her energy, seeing only the people she most needed to see, and only on the days when she was capable of it. She did not attend the royal commissions she effectively designed and staffed. She did not appear in public. She did not make speeches. She worked through letters, hundreds of letters, thousands of letters, an extraordinary sustained correspondence with cabinet ministers, civil servants, military officers, physicians, politicians, hospital administrators, statisticians and newspaper editors, a correspondence that was, in aggregate, one of the most effective instruments of policy reform in Victorian England. And in those 30 years of lying on a couch in a London house, she reformed the sanitary conditions of the British Army in India, a reform that saved more lives than any single military engagement in the same period. She helped design and shape the nursing training system that spread from St Thomas's Hospital, where she'd established a training school across the English-speaking world. She contributed to the Royal Commission on the Health of the Army. She wrote extensively and influentially on hospital design, on the physical layout of wards, on the importance of ventilation and light and cleanliness as medical rather than merely aesthetic concerns. She did all of this from a couch, not from Parliament, not from a government office, not from a hospital board or a military committee room, not from any official position of any kind, because no official position of any kind was available to her from a couch through letters. The mechanisms she used were exactly the mechanisms we've been discussing all evening. Social connection. She cultivated relationships with powerful men with extraordinary care and deployed them strategically. Personal influence. Her correspondence was sought out and valued by cabinet ministers and senior civil servants who understood that her analysis was almost always correct and her recommendations almost always sound. The persuasive power of data, her charts and reports made arguments that could not easily be dismissed and that continued to be cited in policy discussions for decades. She was, in the language we've been using all night, another shadow architect. But she was also something the earlier women we met were not. She was public, visible, famous, and that visibility, which she managed with considerable care and sometimes resented deeply as a burden and a distortion, was itself a form of power. The Lady with the Lamp was a story that the Victorian public had chosen to tell itself about the Crimean War, about nursing, about what women could be and do. Florence was wise enough to understand that the story, however simplified, however sentimental, gave her a platform and a public goodwill that she could spend strategically. She used it, quietly, over decades, from a couch. That, to me, is genuinely quietly extraordinary. And outside Florence's window while she worked, something else was shifting. Something that had been building for decades in the margins and the meeting rooms and the parlours of the Victorian middle classes, among the women who had read Harriet Martineau's books on political economy, who had attended lectures that Mary Somerville's reputation had made possible, who had watched Angela Burdett-Coutts build an empire of charitable institutions, and been told still that they could not vote on the laws that governed their own lives. In 1866, a petition was presented to Parliament. It requested, very simply, that women who met the existing property qualifications for the vote, the same qualifications that entitled men to vote, should be granted it. The petition was organised by two women, Barbara Bardachon, an artist and social activist who'd been arguing for women's legal rights since the 1850s, and Emily Davies, who would go on to found Girton College at Cambridge, the first women's college at either ancient English university. It was signed by 1,499 women. John Stuart Mill, who had been elected to Parliament the previous year partly on a platform of women's suffrage, presented it to the House of Commons. Parliament declined. The margin was not even particularly close. But the presenting of that petition, the formal, documented public demand, was different in character from everything we have discussed tonight. It was not indirect. It was not work through social channels or personal relationships or the strategic placement of dinner guests or the careful cultivation of powerful friends. It was a direct statement. We are here. We exist. We are asking, not suggesting, not hinting, not arranging things from rooms where we were not supposed to have opinions, asking directly in the official record. That directness was new. Not because women had not felt the anger behind it before. They had felt it, many of them, for a long time. But the formal machinery of the suffrage movement, the petitions, the campaigns, the societies, the marches that would eventually come and that would eventually, after decades of extraordinary effort and significant suffering, succeed, that was something different in kind from the shadow influence we've been exploring. It was the beginning of the end of the shadow world. Not immediately, not quickly. The vote for women over 30 would not come until 1918. Full equal suffrage, women voting on the same terms as men, would wait until 1928. The road from that 1866 petition to that 1928 Act was long and difficult, and cost a great deal. But in 1866, in that petition, something turned. The drawing room is very quiet now. The fire has been burning for hours and has settled into something deep and steady. Not the lively, crackling fire of early evening, but the warm, constant glow of embers that will last through the night without requiring any more fuel. The room holds the warmth the way old rooms do, in the walls, in the carpet, in the air itself. The rain outside has softened further. It is barely audible now. Just a faint presence at the edge of the room, like a low note held for a very long time, steady and patient and in no hurry to resolve. The evening is growing late, and we are approaching the part of this story that I have been wanting to reach since we began. The part where we step back from the individual portraits and ask the larger question. What did all of these women, taken together, actually mean? Let me tell you what I think the pattern is. Not what historians argue about, or what political theorists debate, or what feminist scholars have written. Though all of those conversations are valuable and worth having. I want to tell you what I actually see when I step back and look at the whole picture. At Frances Palmerston and Harriet the Duchess and Angela Burdett-Coutts and Harriet Martineau and Mary Somerville and Florence Nightingale and Ada Lovelace and all the others whose names we don't have time for tonight. And there are many others, many women whose contributions are equally real and equally significant and equally forgotten. Here is what I see. I see a parallel system. Victorian England had two systems of power running simultaneously, side by side, and the official histories have almost exclusively documented one of them. The first system was the formal one: Parliament, the courts, the army, the banks, the newspapers, the professional institutions, the law, medicine, the civil service, the established church, the official record of who decided what, when, and why, inscribed in Hansard and in cabinet minutes, and in the columns of the Times, and in the formal correspondence of government departments. This is the system that history books are about. This is the system that has statues and plaques and biographies, and the confidence of having been considered, for most of the last century and a half, simply the way things were. The second system had no name. It had no official existence. It was not written about in newspapers. except occasionally and condescendingly. The political hostess dismissed as a social butterfly, the woman reformer described as eccentric, the female writer praised the charm of her style rather than the substance of her argument. It was not what was meant by the word politics when that word was used. It was not what was meant by the word power. It was not what was meant by influence or authority or consequence. But it was there, consistently, across the whole 63 years of the Victorian era. A web of connection, information, and strategic action that ran parallel to the formal system, interacted with it constantly, and shaped its outcomes in ways that the formal system's participants often preferred not to acknowledge, even to themselves. The women we've met tonight were the architects of that second system, not all of them consciously, not all of them deliberately. Some of them, like Ada Lovelace, were simply doing the work that interested them, with whatever tools and access they had. Some of them, like Frances Palmerston, understood very precisely what they were doing and why, and brought to it the same strategic intelligence that the most capable men of the era brought to their formal political work. But all of them, in their different ways, were operating within the same underlying reality. The formal system excluded them. The informal system was available to them, and within the informal system, the skills that Victorian society had trained them to develop: social intelligence, emotional acuity, long-term relational thinking, the patient management of complex human networks, the ability to exercise influence without the support of formal authority, turned out to be exactly the skills that power required. I find that quietly extraordinary. Not because it proves that the Victorian era was secretly feminist, or that the women of the era had it better than we think. They did not. The restrictions were real, the injustice was real. The damage done to women who had capacities that the system refused to recognize was real and ongoing and enormous. All the scientists who could have been, all the politicians who could have been, all the legal minds and the architects and the engineers and the doctors directed instead into the narrow channel of domestic and social life, regardless of what they were actually suited for. I want to be clear about that. I am not suggesting the Victorian arrangement was clever, or that women should be grateful for it, or that the shadow system was anything other than an inadequate, unjust, deeply limited alternative to full participation. But within those restrictions, the adaptation was also real, and that adaptation, the second system, built in the margins and the drawing rooms and the private correspondence and the quiet hours of the royal household, was not trivial. It was not a consolation prize. It was, in its own terms, a genuine exercise of power. Here is something I want you to think about. The women we've met tonight had between them a form of access that the men around them almost entirely lacked. They had access to each other. Frances Palmerston knew Angela Burdett-Coutts. They moved in the same social world, attended some of the same events, were part of the same overlapping circles of wealthy, influential Victorian women who took an active interest in public life. Angela Burdett-Coutts knew Florence Nightingale. She was one of the early and consistent supporters of nursing reform, and she and Florence shared both a social world and a deep commitment to the idea that private wealth and private effort could change public conditions. Florence Nightingale had read Harriet Martineau, had read her work on political economy, had found in it a model for how a woman could make a serious public argument and have it taken seriously. Harriet Martineau had corresponded with Mary Somerville. They were part of the same community of educated women who took science and learning seriously, who read the same journals, who met at the same gatherings, who were aware of each other's work and in many cases actively admired it. Mary Somerville was a close friend of Ada Lovelace. Their friendship was one of the great intellectual partnerships of the era, the older woman steady and encouraging and systematic, the younger woman volatile and brilliant and prone to seeing implications that no one else had yet seen. Mary understood what Ada was capable of in a way that many of Ada's male contemporaries did not. Harriet the Duchess moved in overlapping circles with all of them. The royal household connected to the aristocratic social world, which connected to the philanthropic world, which connected to the intellectual world, and at various points in that network Harriet was present. This was not coincidence. It was the nature of the social world they all inhabited, a world that was, in its own way, a kind of network, a network of educated, capable, ambitious women who were formally excluded from the official institutions of Victorian life, but who found each other, recognized each other, supported each other, and collectively, sometimes consciously, sometimes not, pushed the boundaries of what was available to them, not always successfully, not always without friction, or competition, or the ordinary human complications of ambition and ego, not without the class divisions and the racial and economic exclusions that complicated everything in the Victorian era as in every other. But there, I want to sit with that for a moment, because we have been taught, I think most of us have absorbed this without quite realizing it, to think of historical women as isolated, as individual exceptions, as singular, remarkable people who somehow stood apart from the undifferentiated mass of women who simply accepted their lot and lived within it. The exceptional woman, the lone genius, the solitary pioneer. These are the frames that history has offered us when it talks about women at all, but that is not the picture that the Victorian record reveals when you look at it carefully. What it reveals is a community of remarkable women who were, in various ways and to varying degrees, aware of each other, who read each other's books, and attended each other's salons and wrote each other letters, and in some cases became genuine and lasting friends, who understood, sometimes explicitly and sometimes only intuitively, that they were part of something larger than their individual lives and individual achievements. They were not isolated. They were, in a very real sense, a network, and networks, as we've established tonight, are a form of power. There is something else in this picture that I want to name. The women of the Victorian era did not simply endure their restrictions. The best of them transformed them. This is not the same as saying the restrictions were acceptable, or that the transformation should have been required, or thus should admire the ingenuity of women who are forced to develop indirect routes to the things that men could reach directly. The indirect route is always harder, it costs more, it takes longer, it produces results that are less certain and less visible and less securely owned than the results of direct access would have been. It is simply to say, as a factual observation, without idealizing any of it, that the restrictions produced, as a kind of unintended consequence, a particular set of skills of indirection, of patience, of the long view, of influence without authority, of building things that last without requiring the builder's name to be attached to them, of maintaining networks across long periods of political change and personal difficulty, when the easier thing would have been to withdraw. These are not small skills. They are not lesser skills. They are in many ways the hardest skills, the ones that the most sophisticated practitioners of power in any era understand and deploy. The skills that distinguish the person who simply holds a position from the person who builds something that actually changes things and lasts. The women of the Victorian era had to master them, not by choice, by necessity. and the mastery was real. Let me tell you one more thing about the pattern. The women in this story are, in a sense, the women history almost lost. Not the women it entirely lost. There are thousands of those. Women whose names we will never recover, whose contributions we'll never document, who did work that mattered enormously and left no trace in the record that survives. Those women are the true unknowns. We cannot tell their stories because we do not have the materials from which stories are made. The women we have been talking about tonight are one step up from that. They are the women who left enough of a trace, enough letters, enough diaries, enough accounts in other people's correspondence, enough secondary documentation, that historians, when they go looking, can find them. But for a long time, the historians were not looking. The history of Victorian England that was written in the 19th and early 20th centuries was written primarily by men, for men, about the formal institutions that men controlled. The political histories were histories of Parliament and the Cabinet. The biographies were biographies of prime ministers and generals and industrialists and scientists. The figures who appeared in the official record, in the places where the official record was made. The second system, the salons, the royal household, the charitable empires, the anonymous journalism, the mathematical notes in the margins of translated papers, the quiet conversations in conservatories that shaped what the Queen told her ministers. That system was not considered history. It was considered background, context, local colour, the social world in which the real history happened, but not the real history itself. It was not. It was history. And the slow work of the last 50 years, the work of a great many historians, many of them women, working through archives and correspondence and diaries and account books that no one had thought worth examining before, has begun to make this visible in a way it has never been before. That work is ongoing. There are names we still do not know, stories we have not yet recovered, contributions we have not yet found the records to document. Every year, in archives across Britain, in collections that have sat unexamined for a century, someone finds a bundle of letters or a diary or an account book that sheds new light on something. A woman we didn't know about, a contribution we hadn't recognized, a connection we hadn't traced. But we are finding them. We are finding her. We are finding them all. The fire in the grate is very low now. It has been burning for the whole of this long evening, and what remains is a deep bed of glowing embers, orange and rust, and the faintest occasional flicker of actual flame that rises and is gone before you can look at it directly. The room is still warm. The warmth has moved into the walls and the furniture and the air itself, the way that warmth from a long fire always does. It will last for hours yet. The rain outside has almost completely stopped. You might not notice it at all if you weren't listening for it. Just occasionally a drip from the gutter, a trickle along the downpipe, the city settling into the deep quiet of very late evening. Somewhere in the distance a clock is striking the hour, not urgently, steadily, the way clocks do in old rooms, in old houses where keeping time is not an emergency but simply a fact, steady and familiar, and part of the background music of a long, comfortable evening. The drawing room is very still, and I want to stay in it for a little while longer, not to cover more ground or introduce more names or make more arguments, just to sit with what we've found here tonight. Because we have found something real, something worth knowing, something that changes the picture, not dramatically, not all at once, but in the way that a new light source changes a room, showing you the depth and the texture of things that were always there but that you hadn't quite seen clearly before. The next part of this story is about what these women left behind, not in monuments or statues or plaques, in something quieter and more lasting than that. Think about what these women left behind, not in the monuments and the statues and the plaques, though some of those exist, not in the official histories which are still, even now, catching up to the full picture, not in the formal record, which was not always designed to include them, and which, in many cases, actively excluded them, in something quieter than that, in the institutions. The hospitals that Florence Nightingale's ideas shaped are still there, not in the same buildings perhaps, not under the same names. The great Victorian hospitals have been rebuilt, extended, merged, renamed, relocated. The wards where Florence walked with her lamp look nothing like the wards of a modern National Health Service hospital. But the principles she established, that a hospital should be clean, that nursing should be a trained profession, that data about patient outcomes should be collected and analysed and used to improve care, that the design of the building itself affects the health of the people inside it. Those principles are so thoroughly woven into the way modern medicine operates that we've entirely forgotten they were once radical. We have forgotten that there was a time when hospitals were considered places where the sick went to die, not places where they went to recover. We have forgotten that nursing was considered unskilled work, suitable for women of low character who had no better option. We have forgotten that the idea of collecting data about mortality rates and analysing it systematically was considered eccentric, even presumptuous. Florence Nightingale did not just introduce those ideas, she embedded them so deeply in the structure of British medicine, and through British medicine in medicine around the English-speaking world, that they became invisible in the best possible way. They became assumptions, foundations, things so obvious that no one thinks to question them. She made the radical ordinary. That is the greatest achievement of a reformer, to make the radical ordinary, to embed the change so deeply in the structure of things that the next generation cannot imagine it ever having been otherwise. Think about the buildings. Angela Burdett-Coutts built hundreds of them. Churches and schools and market halls and model dwellings and vocational training centres and drinking fountains. Some of them are still standing. Some of them are still being used. Not always for the purposes she intended, because the world has changed in ways she could not have anticipated, because populations have shifted and uses have evolved, and the problems of Victorian London are not the problems of modern London. But the buildings are there, physical, tangible, still occupying the same ground they occupied when she paid for their construction, still part of the texture of the city, still making a claim quietly and continuously, simply by existing on the space that surrounds them. There is a particular kind of continuity in a building. A letter can be lost, a diary can be destroyed, a conversation, even the most consequential conversation, even the one that changed the direction of a government, leaves no physical trace once the people who were part of it are gone. The air in which those words were spoken has long since dispersed. The room may have been demolished. The house may not exist, but a building remains. When Angela Burdett-Coutts funded the construction of St. Stephen's Church in Rochester Row in Westminster, a building that opened in 1850 and still stands today, she was making a different kind of argument than the one she made in her letters and her conversations. She was making a permanent argument, one that does not require a biographer to preserve it, or an archivist to protect it, or a historian to rediscover it. It simply stands there, in a city that has changed almost beyond recognition in the century and a half since she paid for it, in a world that has moved on from almost everything that was true in 1850, in a London that is different in its buildings and its population, and its economy and its politics in almost every way that can be measured. Still there. Think about the words. The books that Harriet Martineau wrote are still in print. The illustrations of political economy, which felt urgent and immediate to its original readers, engaged as they were with the live questions of the Corn Laws and free trade and the nature of wages, reads now as a historical document, but it is still there. The arguments are still readable. The intelligence behind them is still apparent. And the novels of George Eliot, the greatest of them, Middlemarch, which is Mary Ann Evans' masterpiece, and which many readers and critics, over the 150 years since it was published, have called one of the greatest novels ever written in the English language. Middlemarch is still being read. Tonight, somewhere in the world, someone is reading Middlemarch for the first time. Perhaps a student, assigned it by a teacher who hopes they will be changed by it in some way they cannot yet articulate. Perhaps an adult who has been meaning to read it for years and finally picked it up on a night when the house was quiet and the moment felt right. Perhaps someone in a hospital bed who needs somewhere else to be for a while. They are reading about Dorothea Brooke and Will Ladislaw and Edward Casaubon and the town of Middlemarch and all the small, precise, heartbreaking human situations that George Eliot constructed with such care. They are reading about idealism and compromise and the limits of good intentions and the way that the most consequential parts of a person's life are often invisible to everyone around them. They are being moved by it, the way that the best fiction moves you, not by arguing with you, but by making you feel something true. George Eliot built that world. Under a man's name, in the middle of the Victorian era, in the face of every assumption her society held about what women could and could not do, what women could and could not know, what women could and could not imagine. She built a world, and people are still living in it. Think about the science. The word scientist, coined because of Mary Somerville, coined to describe a mind that moved across the whole of natural knowledge without belonging entirely to any single discipline. That word now names one of the most respected professions in the world, one of the most consequential, one of the most essential. Every person who calls themselves a scientist today, in every laboratory, in every university, in every research institution, in every field from particle physics to marine biology, to epidemiology to climate science. Every one of those people uses a word that was invented because of a woman who taught herself algebra from a fashion magazine at 11 years old. That is a chain of consequence that stretches from a small room in Jedburgh, Scotland in the 1780s to the present moment. And Somerville College, the Oxford College named in her honour, was founded in 1879 as one of the first colleges to admit women to the ancient English university. The women who studied there in its early decades, in an era when women could attend but still could not formally receive Oxford degrees, a situation that would not be corrected until 1920, went on to extraordinary things. They became scientists, politicians, novelists, economists, doctors, lawyers, civil servants, reformers. They became the next layer of the structure. They carried forward what had been opened, and they opened it further. They educated a generation, and that generation educated another, and that chain, too, reaches without a break into the world we live in tonight. That is what institutions do. They carry forward into futures their founders could not have imagined, the possibility that was first opened by a single act of stubbornness and intelligence and refusal to be excluded. Mary Somerville taught herself algebra from a fashion magazine, and the chain of consequence that runs forward from that small act of private determination reaches, without a single break, into the world we are living in tonight. Think about the idea. Ada Lovelace wrote her notes about the analytical engine in 1843. She died in 1852. The notes were published, attributed to her initials, AAL, in a scientific journal, and then largely forgotten. Not immediately, not entirely, but gradually, as years passed and the analytical engine itself was never built, and the specific questions Ada had been addressing were absorbed into a general scientific understanding of computation that made no particular effort to trace its intellectual lineage. In the 1940s, when engineers in Britain and America were building the first electronic computers, actual working computers, not mechanical proposals, not theoretical diagrams, but real machines that computed, they went looking for theoretical foundations. For someone who had thought clearly, in advance of any actual hardware, about what a general-purpose computing machine might actually be. And they found Ada. Her notes were rediscovered, studied, recognized for what they were, a description written a century before the fact of the conceptual architecture of the modern computer. Alan Turing, who was building the theoretical foundation of computer science in the 1930s and 1940s, engaged directly with the questions Ada had raised. The dialogue between his work and hers, across a century, is one of the stranger and more beautiful convergences in the history of ideas. In 1980, the United States Department of Defense named a new programming language after her. Ada, a programming language, used in real-time systems, in flight control, in air traffic management, in medical systems, in railway control, used in places where the software must not fail because people's lives depend on it. Named for a woman who died at 36, who never saw the machine she was writing about actually built, who spent the last years of her life in pain and debt and obscurity. The machines that run the modern world, the servers that carry this story to wherever you're listening from tonight, the phones in pockets, and the laptops on desks, and the systems embedded in the infrastructure of hospitals and aircraft and power grids and everything else. They speak in a very real sense in a language that carries her name. Think about that. The drawing room is warm and very still. The embers in the grate are deep orange now, breathing quietly, the last of the day's fire settling into itself. They will not flare up again, but they will hold their warmth for a long time yet. That is what good embers do. They hold. The curtains are still drawn. The rain has been quiet for some time now. London beyond the glass is doing what London does in the small hours, not sleeping exactly, but reduced, quieter. The daytime noise compressed down to something softer and more dispersed. Occasional footsteps, a distant vehicle, a door somewhere far away closing. In this room, right now, there is just the warmth, the low light, the steadiness of it. I want to ask you something. When you think about the people who built the world you live in, the physical world, the intellectual world, the institutional world, the world of ideas and language, and the structures through which we organize ourselves, when you think about who those builders were, whose faces and names come to mind, most of us have been given a particular answer to that question, a particular set of faces, a particular roster of names, the ones in the history books we read in school, the ones on the statues we walk past, the ones in the biographies that appear on bestseller lists and the documentaries that fill the television schedules, and those faces and names are not wrong. The people they belong to did do important things, real things, things worth remembering. But they are not the whole picture. The whole picture is larger and more complicated and far more interesting than the version we were given. It includes the rooms we've been in tonight, The salons and the conservatories and the charitable offices and the attic studies and the hospital corridors and the small cold observatory with the dome open to the stars. It includes the women who worked in those rooms and wrote in those rooms and thought in those rooms and changed things from those rooms. The women history almost forgot. Not entirely, not quite. Because the work of finding them back, the slow, patient, necessary work of going into the archives and the letters and the diaries and the account books and saying, she was here, she did this mattered, that work has been ongoing for 50 years, and we are further along that road than we have ever been. There is one last room I want to take you to before this evening ends. It is not a grand room. It is not a drawing room or a royal conservatory or a government study or an attic writing room with stacks of annotated newspapers. It is not the long, cool corridor of a Victorian hospital or an observatory with its dome open to the stars. It is just a quiet room. Wherever you are right now, the room you are in, your bed, your sofa, your favourite chair, the one that knows the shape of you, the one you sink into at the end of the day when the public version of yourself can finally be set down, the lamp that's still on, or the screen that's providing just enough light. These sounds of your own house settling around you, the particular creaks and sighs of a building at rest, sound so familiar you've almost stopped hearing them. I want you to know that the story we have been moving through tonight is not just a Victorian story. It is not just a story about a particular era and a particular set of women and a particular set of restrictions that have, at least in their formal expression, since been lifted. It is not simply a chapter of history that has been concluded, filed away, made safe by distance. It is a story about something that does not change, about the way that intelligence and patience and determination find their channels, whatever the obstacles in the way. Water finds the channel. It always does. It does not argue with the rock. It goes around it, under it, through the smallest available gap. The women in this story found their channels, every one of them, about the way that influence, real, lasting, consequential influence, does not always announce itself loudly, or plant a flag, or require a formal title or a public platform. The most durable influence often happens quietly, in rooms that are not being watched, in conversations that are not being recorded, in the slow, persistent, patient work of people who have decided that the world can be arranged differently and who are going to spend their lives, or the part of their lives that is available to them, trying to make it so. About the way that the rooms that history forgets are sometimes the rooms where the most important work is done. That is true now as it was true then. The most durable things and the most important institutions, the most lasting ideas, the most consequential decisions, they very often begin in quiet rooms, in conversations that leave no official record, in the private hours of people who are simply trying, with whatever tools they have, to make something better than they found it. Not for recognition, not for the history books, not for the statue in the public square, just because it needs doing. That is what the women in this story were doing, and that is what the people working in quiet rooms right now are doing too, including perhaps you. And if you are doing that work, if you are the person in the quiet room, doing the thing that needs doing, carrying knowledge that the official record will not find useful to preserve, then this story is also for you. Not as instruction or encouragement, just as recognition, as a small, quiet acknowledgement that this is how things have always been built, slowly, carefully, without fanfare. It is late now, the kind of late that has a particular quality to it. Not just the hour on a clock, but a feeling, the feeling that the world has turned down its own volume by several notches, that the ordinary business of the day has retreated, that the sounds that fill daylight hours, the movement, the conversation, the traffic and the alerts and the low-level hum of everything happening at once, have stepped back into the walls and left something quieter in their place, something that feels a little like permission to stop, to let the mind slow, to set down the things you are carrying and let the evening do what evenings are for. You know this feeling. You're probably feeling it right now. The city outside is sleeping, or at least the part of it nearest to you is sleeping. Great cities are never entirely still. There is always a corner of them awake, always something moving, always a light on in a window that looks out onto an empty street, always someone somewhere still working, still thinking, still carrying the weight of whatever they are carrying. But the particular corner of the city that belongs to this evening, to this story, to this long, warm, slow descent through the rooms of Victorian England, that corner is still now. The embers have faded further. They're still glowing, just barely, just enough to warm the air in the room and cast a faint amber colour across the ceiling. Nothing you would call light exactly, more like the memory of light, more like the idea of a fire still present after the fire itself has gone. The curtains are very still, no wind tonight. The window behind them is dark, London out there, wet and quiet and settled into itself. And somewhere in the distance, faint, unhurried, barely reaching this room at all, a clock is striking the hour. Listen to it. 1, 2, 3. Then silence again. I've been thinking in these last quiet minutes about the women we've been with tonight. Not thinking about facts. I've given you enough of those. Not about dates or titles or the names of institutions. Those things are in their place. They have been said. I've been thinking about something simpler. I've been thinking about what it must have felt like to be in the drawing room at Cambridge House on a Saturday evening in 1852, as the carriages arrived and the guests came through the door one by one, and the conversation began to fill the room. To feel the particular, quiet anticipation of knowing exactly how you have arranged things. To know which two men needed to stand near each other in the first 20 minutes before the dinner was announced, before the natural flow of the evening had established its own direction. To know which introduction to make and how to frame it, and exactly when to step back and let the conversation find its own velocity. To carry all of that knowledge quietly, to exercise all of that skill invisibly, to shape an entire evening, and through the evening perhaps something larger than an evening, without leaving a single trace in the official record. What did that feel like? I find myself genuinely wondering. Not with pity. These were not women to be pitied. They were too capable for that, too precise, too aware of what they were doing and why. They are not diminished by their situation. They are shaped by it, in the same way that a river is shaped by the landscape it runs through, defined by the constraints, made what it is by the particular path it has found, but with something like admiration, quiet admiration, the kind you feel for a craft so accomplished it appears effortless, the kind that makes you look again, more carefully, and understand that what seemed simple was anything but. And I've been thinking about the room at Windsor, the conservatory in the late afternoon of a winter day, the glass roof filtering grey light onto tropical plants that should not exist in this cold English castle but do, strange and vivid and alive, the smell of damp earth and something green and growing. Victoria and Harriet walking slowly, not quite in step, the older woman matching the Queen's pace because that is what you do in the presence of monarchy, but also simply because there is no hurry, because this is one of the few corners of royal life where hurry is not required. The particular quality of ease between two people who genuinely trust each other, who have earned each other's confidence over years of honest conversation, who have sat together in the dark and difficult moments as well as the ceremonial ones. What were they talking about? We can guess from the letters, from the fragments and the accounts and the private records that have survived. We have some of the words, not all of them, and I find something unexpectedly beautiful in that, in the fact that the conversation is gone, not the consequences of it. Those remained, those shaped things, those left marks on the record of the era that historians have been finding for decades now, when they look carefully enough. But the words themselves, the particular words they said to each other in that warm, glass-roofed room on a winter afternoon, with the light fading and the sound of the castle settling around them, those are gone. They belong to those two women, in that room, on that afternoon. They were said and heard and settled into the air and are gone now, the way that all spoken words eventually are, even the most important ones, even the ones that change the course of something, and somehow knowing that some things remain private, that not everything is recoverable, that there are rooms in history that will stay closed, and conversations that belonged only to the people who had them. Somehow that makes the whole thing feel more human, more real. The fire is very nearly out now, just a few embers deep in the grate, orange-red, fading slowly, the way fires always fade, not all at once, but gradually, one small degree at a time, the colour shifting from bright orange to deep rust to something barely distinguishable from the darkness around it, still radiating warmth. You can feel it if you hold your hand out toward the grate, a gentle, persistent heat that asks nothing of you, offers nothing but comfort. The room has grown a little darker. Not dark, just darker. The kind of gradual darkening that you barely notice because it happens so slowly, until you look up and realize that what was warm amber light is now dim, and what was dim is now simply the color of late night. It is comfortable here. You've been comfortable here for a while now. Settled. The particular kind of settled that comes not from anything you have done deliberately, but from a long evening of calm and warmth and the slow, unhurried movement of a story through rooms you have never been in but somehow recognize. That recognition is real. Something I find quietly interesting about the way history works when it is told well. The way it can make you feel at home in a past that is not yours, can make a Victorian drawing room with its heavy green wallpaper and its coal fire and its curtains drawn against the evening rain feel as familiar and as right as the room you are actually in. Let me tell you something I find genuinely true. The past is not as far away as it looks. The drawing rooms we've walked through tonight are over 150 years gone. The women we've spent this evening with have been dead for a century, most of them. The world they inhabited, the world of salons and country house weekends and royal households and anonymous journalism and handwritten letters sealed with wax and dispatched by hand, that world has been replaced by something so different it might as well be a different planet. And yet, the things they were working with, the human things, those are the same. The desire to do meaningful work, the frustration of being told you cannot, the creative intelligence that finds its own path when the official path is closed, the deep satisfaction of a conversation that changes something real, the long, patient investment in relationships that may not pay off for years, but when they do, change the course of things, the love of learning, the hunger to understand the world more clearly than you found it, the pleasure of sitting in a warm room with a good lamp and a good story, while outside the world continues its business, wet and complicated and entirely unaware that in here, something quiet and important is happening. Those things are the same. They were the same in the 1850s in the drawing rooms of Mayfair. They were the same in 1843 in the room where Ada Lovelace was writing the notes that would eventually help build the machine that carries this story to you. They were the same in 1834 in the quiet room where Mary Somerville was finishing the book that would require the invention of a new word to describe its author. They are the same tonight, in whatever room you're in, wherever in the world you are, however late it is where you are, and however long the day was. That is what history is, in the end. Not the dates and the Acts of Parliament, not the treaties and the battles and the formal record of who held which office when. History is the recognition that the people who came before us were as alive as we are, as particular, as complicated, as aware of the passage of time and the preciousness of it, as in need of warmth and rest, as human as you are right now, in this room, at this hour. The embers are almost gone, just a faint glow now, the colour of deep rust, or of a candle seen through heavy glass. You would not call it firelight anymore, but it is still there, still holding something back against the dark. Your breathing has slowed, I notice that, the way it does, late in a long evening, when the body has decided that whatever kept it tense through the day can be set down now. When the muscles in your shoulders find their way toward the mattress, or the cushion, or the arm of a chair that has learned the shape of you. When the thoughts that were moving become thoughts that are drifting, unmooring themselves from urgency, floating. This is the right time of night for that. This is what the evening was for. I want to say one last thing before you sleep. The women we've spent this evening with, Frances, Harriet, Angela, Harriet Martineau, George Eliot, Ada, Mary, Florence, and the thousands of others whose names we will never recover, they did not know they would be remembered. Most of them didn't expect it. The ones who wrote did not know whether their books would survive. The ones who built did not know whether their buildings would still be standing a century and a half later. The ones who influenced did not know whether anyone would ever go looking through the correspondence and the diaries and the private accounts to find the traces of what they had done. They worked anyway, not for posterity, not for recognition, for the work itself, for the world as it was right in front of them, in the rooms they were actually in. They sat at desks like this one, in rooms like this one, in evenings that probably felt just like this evening, a little late, a little quiet, the day's business done, the night coming in around the edges, and they did the thing that needed doing, because it needed doing. That is, I think, the most honest and most human thing you can say about any of them. They were here, they worked, they left something. And tonight, in this room, in this story, we found some of it. Sleep well. Wherever you are tonight, tucked into bed, stretched out on the sofa, in your favourite chair with a blanket pulled up and the lights almost off. Sleep well. The city is quiet. The fire is out. The rain, if it is raining where you are, is barely a whisper against the glass. The women in this story have been resting for 100 years. They can wait a little longer. Tonight, it is your turn. Let everything else go. The decisions, the worries, the things left undone, the things that need doing tomorrow, they will be there in the morning. They are patient. They do not require your attention right now. Right now there is just the warmth of the room, the quiet, the slow, even rhythm of your own breathing. The past settling, the present very still. And somewhere in the long distance of time, a drawing room with green walls and a fire in the grate, and a woman sitting quietly, reading by lamplight, long after everyone else has gone to bed. She's still there, in a way, in the story, in the buildings, in the books, in the language, in the science and the mathematics and the institutions and the ideas that shape the world you woke up in this morning and will wake up in tomorrow. She is still there, and so are you. Sleep well. Good night, friend.